Hello, my dear friends. They used to lick their hands after holding public doorknobs, kiss each other on the cheek to greet each other, and wash their towels with their baby diapers. These were not rare accidents, but daily routines for countless Victorian women. They called it politeness, natural neatness, and feminine culture. But beneath the floral dresses and gentle smiles, germs quietly spread with every touch, every hug, every sip of shared tea. Tonight, join me in opening the door to a world that seems elegant but is filled with the silent dangers of seemingly harmless things. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If a woman in Victorian times wanted to be admired for her pale complexion, she often turned to creams made with lead and mercury. These mixtures promised a face as white as porcelain, a sign of refinement and beauty. The jars were sold openly in markets and pharmacies, packaged as though they were remedies or luxuries, while in truth they were slow-acting poisons. The creams clung to the skin, day after day, layered thick without proper washing. What looked like elegance on the surface was in fact the beginning of deep and lasting harm. The habit of painting the face with these powders was not confined to the wealthy. Even women with little money found cheap versions of the creams, made with the same deadly ingredients but mixed more crudely. The white paste gave them the look that society demanded, a kind of proof that they belonged in polite company. Once applied, it sat heavily on the skin, sealing pores and burning slowly. Without daily cleansing, which was rare in Victorian routines, the layers hardened. Dust and sweat only made the mixture worse, forming a crust that women wore like a mask. Doctors of the period noticed the damage but had little influence. They saw women losing their hair, their teeth darkening, and their skin breaking into sores. Still, the products remained popular. Beauty was a form of survival in that society, and the price of beauty was accepted, even if the price was illness. The creams carried a faint metallic taste when they touched the lips, but this too was ignored. The marketplace continued to thrive on the ignorance and desperation of women who only wished to be seen as proper. Lead was known to weaken the body, but in cosmetics it had an allure. Its chalky texture gave the illusion of purity. Mercury, added for brightness, brought a sheen that looked like health, but was really decay. With each use, the toxins are passed through the skin into the bloodstream, settling in nerves and organs. Women grew tired, their hands trembled, and their thoughts dulled. Yet these changes came slowly enough that few connected them to the creams. In crowded dressing rooms, women passed jars between one another, speaking softly about the newest brand or the smoothness of a certain paste. There was no concern for safety, no knowledge of long-term harm. The smell of the creams filled the air, sharp and chemical. Once smeared across the cheeks, the appearance was striking. The skin looked even, free of blemish, glowing under the dim gas lamps. Behind the glow was damage building layer by layer. It almost feels absurd that what was called refinement was really just rubbing poison on the skin every morning. The cycle of harm continued because alternatives were rare. Proper soap and clean water were luxuries for many households. Washing one's face daily was not part of common custom, so the layers of cream remained intact. By the week's end, a woman's face might carry the residue of every morning before it. The powder gathered in lines and creases, making removal more difficult. Any attempt to scrub caused redness, which in turn encouraged the use of more cream to hide it. Reports of sickness made their way into newspapers, but these were often dismissed as exaggeration. The link between cosmetics and illness was too inconvenient to acknowledge. Merchants denied any danger, and customers kept buying. The desire to look pale and proper outweighed fears of unseen consequences. Even when a neighbour fell ill, it was easier to assume she was naturally weak rather than poisoned. The myth of fragile women fits well with society's expectations, hiding the truth of chemical harm. In homes, jars of cream stood next to mirrors, ready for use. A mother might pass her habits down to her daughter, sharing the same jar and the same risks. The cream's smell became familiar, part of the household routine. Its smooth texture comforted women who longed to meet the rigid standards placed upon them. Beneath that comfort, lead and mercury worked their way deeper, eroding health in silence. It is not hard to compare this with modern cosmetics that sometimes hide harsh chemicals under bright labels, though today we at least expect someone to test them before sale. The results grew worse with time. Women reported numbness in their fingers, difficulty in speaking, and sudden fainting. Some lost their hair entirely. The face that once looked smooth began to sag, leaving behind the very flaws the creams had promised to conceal. Families watched their mothers and daughters decline, but explanations were vague. Weak nerves, poor diet, or natural frailty were blamed instead. The true reason remained unspoken, buried beneath layers of powder. I find myself unsettled when thinking about how willingly people accepted damage for the sake of appearances, as if pain and beauty were expected to live together. This practice reveals much about the era. A society that spoke so loudly of morality was comfortable with poisoning its women in the name of elegance. The empire prided itself on progress, yet could not protect half its population from the dangers of daily vanity. The white face that symbolized refinement was nothing more than a mask hiding silent decay. Every application added another measure of harm, invisible but real. Women stepped into public life with smiles, their cheeks powdered white, their lips touched with colour. No one spoke of the shaking hands, the headaches, the dull eyes. The creams promised purity, but delivered slow ruin. Shops thrived. Chemists mixed new jars, and the cycle of selling and buying continued. It was a quiet disaster, repeated across drawing rooms and marketplaces, accepted as normal. The story of lead and mercury in cosmetics is more than a detail of fashion. It is a glimpse into a world where survival often meant harm disguised as beauty. Poverty, ignorance, and rigid standards all played a part. The white face of a Victorian lady was not a sign of health, but of a society willing to sacrifice safety for appearance. It was a reflection of values that prized image over truth, leaving scars that could not be hidden forever. The white powders on the skin were a slow betrayal. They seemed to promise refinement but delivered weakness and illness. Behind every painted face was a hidden cost, one that families learned only when it was too late. The use of poisonous creams left women weak and broken, even as society praised their pale beauty. The routines of daily life carried the danger forward without question. And while these creams ruined the health of countless women, another habit just as ordinary carried its own risks, passed from one head to another in silence. The comb sat on a wooden shelf, always within reach, and it belonged to everyone in the household. Mothers used it first, smoothing their hair before stepping into the day. Daughters followed, running it quickly through their own strands, and then the servant girl finished the routine, leaving the teeth clogged with oil and dust. The comb was rarely washed, never scrubbed, and no one considered that it might carry more than just hair. It looked harmless, a simple object of daily life. Yet it became a quiet bridge for infection. Hair care in Victorian homes did not resemble what we think of today. Shampoo did not exist in the form we now know, and clean water was a limited luxury. Women rubbed their hair with mixtures of animal fat blended with crushed flowers, believing this softened strands and gave them shine. The smell was strong, heavy, and not entirely pleasant, but it was a habit that families accepted. When combs passed through such coated hair, they picked up more than oil. Bits of skin, sweat, and unseen fungi clung to the wood and stayed there until the next head received them. This sharing of a single tool seemed efficient, even sensible, in houses where money was scarce. Buying several combs was unnecessary when one could serve all. No one saw danger in this practice, only convenience. The poor did not own many personal items, and privacy in grooming was rare. Yet in this economy of objects, disease found an easy path. It feels almost comical now to think of families carefully sharing one filthy comb as if that counted as care. Head lice thrived in such conditions. They crawled from one scalp to another with little effort, settling in hair that was seldom cleaned. Once lice appeared, itching followed, but scratching only made wounds worse. Fungal infections also spread quickly, leaving patches of scaling skin and bald spots that were slow to heal. Some women believed these marks were a sign of weak blood or bad fortune, never realizing the true cause was the comb sitting in plain sight. The servants suffered most. They often used the comb last, after the others had already left their residue. Their hair carried the burdens of every head before them, and their complaints were rarely heard. Even in wealthier homes, where more than one comb might exist, the practice of sharing remained common. There was little awareness of hygiene or the concept of personal items. To Victorian households, hair care was a communal act, not an individual one. Doctors sometimes noted the link between shared tools and outbreaks of scalp disease, but their warnings carried little weight. Without the science of microbes, most people dismissed the idea of invisible causes. They saw lice as inevitable, not preventable, and fungi as a nuisance rather than a threat. Women wore bonnets and caps, which helped conceal the sores, so the problem remained hidden in plain sight. Families continued their routines, scratching at night, combing each morning, never breaking the cycle. The setting of the market added another layer of risk. Combs were sold cheaply, carved roughly from wood or bone, and displayed in piles. Buyers handled them freely, turning them over with dirty fingers before choosing one. Any object purchased there already carried the marks of many hands. Once brought home, the comb simply joined the chain of transmission. Its surface trapped everything it touched, and in houses where washing tools was unheard of, this became a permanent reservoir of infection. Children were especially vulnerable. Their scalps were tender, and they scratched until bleeding. Small wounds opened paths for deeper infection, leading to swollen glands and fevers. Parents did not always connect these illnesses to the comb. They believed children were naturally fragile, quick to fall sick. In reality, the tool they trusted to tidy hair was slowly undermining their health. If we imagine this habit today, it would be like an entire household brushing their teeth with the same unwashed toothbrush day after day. The consequences stretched beyond physical harm. Girls with patchy hair often faced shame. Beauty standards were strict, and visible marks on the scalp could be seen as a sign of neglect or poverty. Yet the very effort to look presentable, to keep hair neat and smooth, was what spread the problem. The contradiction reveals the strange balance of Victorian life, where appearances mattered more than the hidden truths beneath them. I cannot help but think of how something as ordinary as grooming could quietly decide who remained healthy and who carried scars for life. Over time, infestations grew so common that they became normalized. Mothers expected children to have lice at some point. Servants accepted constant itching as part of their lot. Remedies existed, such as vinegar rinses or herbal washes, but these were not always affordable or used consistently. Without regular cleaning, even the remedies failed. The comb remained central, passed from hand to hand, binding the household together in sickness. Inside dimly lit rooms, where candles flickered against mirrors, the act was repeated daily. One woman's hair was smoothed, then another's, until the teeth of the comb were thick with residue. The surface gleamed from grease, and sometimes strands dangled from its edges, but no one paused to clean it. It seemed unthinkable to waste time scrubbing such a tool when there was work to be done. The object was too ordinary to attract suspicion, too necessary to discard. This detail of domestic life may seem small, but it reflects the larger truths of the age. In a society without clear knowledge of hygiene, the smallest habits carried enormous risks. What was seen as thrift or efficiency could become a silent danger. Families passed down traditions, not realizing they also passed down infections. The comb was not just a tool but a vessel, carrying the traces of every user, weaving health and sickness together in ways they could not imagine. The shared comb connected people physically, its teeth scratching through every scalp in turn. With each stroke, it moved more than hair. It spread discomfort, infection, and weakness, hidden under the guise of care. The family ritual of grooming was, in truth, a ritual of disease. The household comb was a bridge for lice, fungi, and infection, passed daily between women and children. The act of sharing, seen as harmless, became an invisible threat that shaped their health, and as hair carried away its silent burdens. Another part of daily life carried dangers too. Waiting in the water meant to cleanse the body itself. The bathtub in a Victorian home was not the shining porcelain image that comes to mind today. It was often a large wooden or metal tub, dragged into the centre of a room and filled with water that was precious and hard to heat. Families used it sparingly, which meant the same water was expected to serve several people in turn. A mother might step in first, followed by her daughters, then the servants, all dipping into the same cloudy bath. The water grew darker with each body that entered, yet no one considered it unfit for use. What looked like thrift and order was, in truth, the creation of a breeding ground for disease. Bathing was not a daily ritual in most homes. For many, once a week seemed more than enough. Clean water was not easy to obtain, and heating it required fuel that cost money. The idea of emptying the tub after one person's wash felt wasteful, so the practice of sharing became normal. The addition of a little hot water kept the bath feeling fresh enough, but the filth remained. Skin flakes, sweat, and dirt floated unseen, mixing into a broth that clung to the next bather's skin. The practice seemed reasonable to those who lived it. Families saw it as a sign of care, providing a shared chance to feel refreshed. The faint warmth of the water gave comfort, and the illusion of cleanliness was enough to please. It almost sounds laughable now to imagine calling such a filthy bath an act of hygiene. Yet in the crowded homes of Victorian towns, there were few alternatives. Privacy was rare, luxury rarer, and no one could afford to be wasteful. Cholera was the hidden consequence. The disease was already present in the water supplies of many cities, spreading through contaminated wells and pumps. Once it entered a household, a shared bathtub made sure it touched everyone. The water looked ordinary, perhaps only slightly clouded, but it carried bacteria strong enough to bring cramps, vomiting, and death within hours. Families could not see this danger. They stepped into the water with trust, unaware that it was carrying illness from one body to the next. The middle classes, who prided themselves on refinement, often followed this practice as well. They believed their homes were cleaner than those of the poor, yet their tubs were no different. Curtains were drawn, candles lit, and the ritual of bathing became part of family order. But no amount of order could change what was happening beneath the surface of the water. Bubbles that rose looked harmless, but they carried traces of waste and infection. Servants usually washed last. By then, the water was a heavy stew of oils and grime. Their bodies absorbed what others had left behind, and they often carried sickness more severely. Few paid attention when servants fell ill. It was easier to call them weak or unlucky than to question the routines of the household. The truth was less convenient. The very practice meant to clean was seeding disease. Doctors and reformers began to notice patterns. Outbreaks of cholera struck families who seemed healthy only days before. Whole neighbourhoods suffered at once, and the shared bathtub was often part of the story. Still, warnings were slow to spread. Hygiene was not yet understood in the way we know it today. Germ theory was still young, and many clung to older beliefs about bad air or weak constitutions. The tub, a fixture of domestic pride, did not look like a threat. Markets sold soaps and powders to add to the bath, but these did little to stop disease. The scents masked smells, not germs. Families sprinkled herbs into the water, hoping it would purify, but it only floated alongside the filth. The tub was not drained until every scheduled bather had finished. By then, the water was thick, murky, and carrying sickness that no one could see. If we compared it to modern times, it would be as though an entire neighbourhood tried to drink from the same unwashed glass, adding only a little water to stretch it further. Children often suffered first. Their smaller bodies were more vulnerable, and cholera showed no mercy. Parents tried to comfort them, unaware that the bath itself had delivered the illness. To the family, death seemed to come out of nowhere. Another tragedy in a world already full of them. Few connected the dots, and so the practice continued, repeated in households across the city. The shared tub also shaped how women experience cleanliness. They were expected to appear neat and to smell presentable, yet were given no tools to achieve this safely. Their long skirts and petticoats carried dirt from outside into the water. When they stepped out of the bath, they felt renewed, but their skin often bore the beginnings of infection. The standards of appearance were met, while the body beneath grew weaker. I find it disturbing to imagine a ritual meant to refresh the body serving instead as a silent doorway to death. For the authorities, outbreaks of cholera were blamed on poverty and carelessness, but the middle classes suffered just the same. Disease did not respect social boundaries. The bath was a symbol of order and refinement, yet it betrayed every user. By sharing one tub, households guaranteed that if illness touched one member, it would touch them all. The ritual of bathing became a paradox. It was meant to be clean, but it did the opposite. It bound families together not in health, but in sickness. Each addition of warm water only extended the life of the danger floating inside. The comfort of the tub disguised the fact that it was no safer than a stagnant puddle in the street. The shared bathtub carried with it the illusion of hygiene, while quietly spreading cholera and other diseases through the very act of bathing. Families clung to the routine, blind to the risk, and the water that should have renewed them became their undoing. Yet water was not only dangerous in baths. Even in the tasks of washing clothes, women carried risks that could turn an ordinary act into a pathway for infection. The cloths used by women during their monthly bleeding were simple pieces of fabric, folded and refolded to absorb what they could. They were not disposable, not private, and certainly not sanitized. After use, these cloths were rinsed by hand in cold water, often without soap, and set aside to be used again. The act was done quickly, sometimes in the same tubs or basins that served the household for cooking and cleaning. What seemed like an efficient use of water and tools carried invisible risks that few could imagine. Blood clung to the fibres of the cloth, thickening with each use. Cold water removed some stains, but never all. The traces that remained became a place where bacteria thrived, hidden in folds that looked clean enough once dried. When these cloths were rinsed in basins later used to wash vegetables or boil soup, the contamination spread easily. It passed silently from one task to another, moving from the most intimate corners of a woman's body to the mouths of her family. For women, there was no clear understanding of hygiene during menstruation. The subject was private, rarely spoken of, and considered unfit for open discussion. With silence came ignorance. There were no separate basins for menstrual cloths, no rules to keep them apart from other items of the household. A woman might rinse her clothes and then use the same tub to wash her children's clothes. The overlap felt natural, even necessary, but it was an overlap that linked blood, food, and health in dangerous ways. The absence of soap made the problem worse. Soap was expensive and not always available, especially for the poor. Even when families had homemade soap, they saved it for visible dirt on hands or garments. Cloths used for menstruation did not seem to warrant such care. A quick rinse in cold water appeared sufficient. What the eyes could no longer see was assumed to be gone, In reality, bacteria remained, ready to multiply as the cloth dried in dark corners of the home. It almost seems absurd that a fabric soaked in blood could be dipped once in cold water and then considered ready for use again. Yet in Victorian homes, this was routine. There were no factories producing clean pads, no systems for safe disposal. Women made do with what they had, and what they had was never enough to be safe. The mixing of menstrual cloths with ordinary laundry blurred every boundary. Sheets, undergarments, and children's clothing were washed in the same tubs, rubbed side by side with cloths carrying dried blood. Sometimes the water was later poured into basins for scrubbing dishes. The cycle of reuse left no chance for separation. Families unknowingly consumed traces of what should have been carefully discarded. Doctors occasionally wrote of unexplained stomach illnesses or outbreaks of infection in homes where no outside cause could be found. They did not always connect the sickness to laundry, but the link was there, in cramped kitchens where food was prepared beside piles of laundry. The contamination was constant. Women touched blood-soaked cloths, rinsed them, and, without washing their hands thoroughly, turned to stir a pot or feed a child. If we think of it in modern terms, it would be like rinsing a used medical bandage in the sink and then using that same sink to prepare dinner. Children suffered most from these hidden risks. Their bodies, still small and unprotected, reacted severely to bacteria carried into food and drink. Cases of diarrhea and fever were common, and death from such illnesses was frequent in poor districts. Families accepted this as fate, never realizing that their own practices were helping disease take hold. What looked like thrift and efficiency was in truth a routine of infection. I find it deeply unsettling to imagine mothers acting with care and duty, unknowingly passing illness into the mouths of their children. The contradiction is painful acts meant to protect the family instead harmed them. Women were not careless, they were left without knowledge, without tools, and without alternatives. Their silence was shaped by shame, and shame made them blind to the dangers they carried in their own hands. The air inside kitchens often carried the scent of boiling broth, mixed with the damp smell of drying laundry. Cloths were hung in corners, sometimes beside food storage, where they gathered mould. The bacteria in the blood found perfect conditions in these places, dark, moist, and warm. When the clothes were taken again for use, they carried not just old stains but fresh colonies of infection. Women endured the discomfort, rarely questioning why rashes and sores grew worse after each cycle. Reformers who wrote about sanitation did not often address menstruation. It was a subject too hidden, too taboo. As a result, the dangers remained invisible in public debate. While cities fought cholera with new water systems, the private routines of women continued unchanged. Illness spread quietly within households, carried on by practices no one dared to challenge. This detail of life reveals how deeply poverty and ignorance shaped Victorian health. Women bore the burden of managing both their own bodies and the needs of the family, yet were given no safe means to do so. Cloths that should have been washed separately or discarded entirely became long-term tools of harm. Kitchens that should have been places of nourishment became laboratories of infection. The line between food and filth was crossed daily, and no one spoke of it. The story of menstrual cloths rinsed in cooking basins is not simply one of hygiene but of silence. Silence around women's bodies kept knowledge away, and without knowledge, every act carried hidden dangers. What looked ordinary was in fact extraordinary in its risk. The very fabric that women trusted became a vessel for harm, carrying bacteria from one cycle to the next, from private life into the meals of the household. The rinsing of menstrual cloths in cooking basins allowed bacteria to move freely from blood to food, creating illness that families never traced to its true cause. Women believed they were fulfilling their duties, but their practices only deepened the risks of daily life. And while water made dangerous by blood carried its own hidden costs, another practice of hiding smells with flowers would spread sickness in ways no one expected. Women in Victorian times often turned to flowers not just for decoration, but as a shield against their own bodies. Instead of washing regularly, many placed dried lavender or rose petals inside their undergarments or tucked them between the layers of their heavy dresses. At first, the fragrance seemed to mask the odour of sweat, giving the impression of cleanliness and refinement. The flowers were easy to obtain, they looked delicate, and they carried with them a sense of respectability. Yet once pressed against warm, damp skin, they quickly transformed from tokens of freshness into hidden nests of decay. Moisture from the body soaked into the petals. What had been crisp and fragrant soon became soggy and discoloured. Within days, the flowers began to rot, turning soft and dark, clinging to fabric and skin. Their dampness provided the perfect breeding ground for mould, which spread quietly in folds of cloth. The smell that emerged was not the sweet perfume once promised, but a sour, rancid stench that grew stronger each day. It feels almost ridiculous that something meant to cover a bad smell became the source of an even worse one. Women endured this because the alternative felt shameful. Talking about body odour was considered indecent, and bathing often was not practical. Without access to proper soap and water, the insertion of flowers seemed like a clever solution. It gave a sense of effort, a gesture toward refinement, even if the results were the opposite. Society rewarded appearances, and no one wanted to admit that beneath elegant gowns lay damp blossoms turning into mush. The problem was more than unpleasant smells. The constant contact of rotting petals against sensitive skin caused irritation. Women developed rashes that itched and burned. Small sores appeared, which became infected as bacteria thrived in the moist environment. In severe cases, swollen lymph nodes and pus-filled abscesses developed, leaving women weak and in pain. They rarely connected these health problems to the flowers they carried daily. Illness was considered fate, not a consequence of personal habits. The contrast between the outward elegance of a lady and the hidden rot beneath her dress is stark. Guests at a gathering might admire the fragrance of lavender in the air, never realizing that the scent mixed with the sourness of decay. The effort to appear refined turned into a trap of discomfort and disease. Yet because everyone followed similar practices, the problem became invisible. No one questioned it, and no one stopped. Markets encouraged the habit. Stalls sold bundles of dried herbs and flowers, advertising them as purifiers of the body. Pamphlets praised lavender as a cure for foul odours and rose petals as a natural cleanser. These claims were comforting, cheap, and easy to believe. Women carried sachets of petals in their clothing, never suspecting that once trapped in sweat, the cure became a poison. If we imagine this in modern terms, it would be like placing air fresheners inside clothing instead of taking a shower. Servants often copied their mistresses, filling their own clothes with crushed petals. They had even fewer opportunities for proper bathing, so they relied heavily on these tricks. Their physical labour meant more sweat, which meant the flowers decayed faster. The irritation on their skin was worse, but complaints were rarely heard. They continued with their work, scratching beneath heavy dresses, enduring the burning discomfort in silence. I find it unsettling to think of women believing they were protecting themselves from shame while actually carrying mould and infection pressed tightly against their skin. The irony is heavy. They trusted in something gentle and fragrant, never realizing it was turning against them. Each day, as they dressed, they repeated the same mistake, a mistake encouraged by the standards of their society. Inside crowded rooms, the problem multiplied. Heat from gatherings caused women to sweat more, and the flowers decayed faster. The combined odours of mould, sweat, and perfume filled the air, sometimes strong enough to cause faintness. Accounts exist of women collapsing in theatres or assemblies, where the mix of smells became unbearable. These incidents were rarely blamed on hygiene. People pointed instead to weak nerves or poor ventilation, leaving the true causes unspoken. The habit reveals the tension of the era. Victorian society valued appearance above truth, elegance above health. Women bore the pressure of this standard most heavily, forced to hide their natural bodies in layers of fabric and false remedies. They were trapped between shame and ignorance, their solutions making them sick while their silence kept them from seeking change. The flowers that symbolized purity were in reality breeding grounds for disease. This detail of life shows how easily beauty and health were sacrificed for the sake of social expectations. A fragrant solution became a source of rot, and women accepted it as normal. They carried on with routines that harmed them, convinced they were doing the right thing. In this way, the standards of refinement became instruments of suffering, turning ordinary flowers into silent threats. Dried flowers hidden in clothing were meant to mask odour, but they created rot, irritation, and infection instead. Women believed they were guarding their dignity, yet they only exposed themselves to new dangers. And while flowers caused illness pressed against the skin, even the clothes themselves, unwashed and unchanged, carried risks that grew worse with every passing day. The theatres of Victorian cities were places of elegance, with velvet curtains, polished balconies, and chandeliers glowing above the crowds. Women arrived in layers of gowns, their dresses heavy with fabric and ornament. From a distance, the sight was magnificent, but closer inspection revealed a far less graceful truth. Beneath the folds of silk and lace, there were hidden bundles of dried flowers, sachets of herbs, and garments that had not been washed for weeks. Heat from the crowded hall and the weight of the clothes turned these secret additions into something far more dangerous than perfume. As bodies pressed together in tight rows, the scents began to mix. Sweat soaked into the gowns, dampening the flowers and herbs sewn or stuffed into place. Instead of masking odour, the combination created a sour, sickly smell, sharp enough to sting the nose. Accounts from the time described the stench rising from women's dresses as comparable to rotting waste. The irony was striking. What had been meant as elegance turned into decay. It is almost humorous in the darkest way that a society obsessed with refinement ended up making its theatres smell like compost heaps. The chemical reactions were not imaginary. Sweat mixed with the oils of dried petals, with powders sprinkled into the layers of cloth, and with the dust of city streets carried in by hems dragging along the ground. The result was a damp, fermenting stew pressed tightly against skin. As hours passed in warm, airless theatres, the fumes grew heavier. In one recorded case from 1874, the air around 5 women seated together became so unbearable that another lady in the same row fainted. The cause was not weakness, as many suggested, but the sheer force of the odour. Theatre staff struggled with this reality. Ventilation was poor, and windows were rarely opened during performances. Gas lamps added heat, raising the temperature even further. Patrons fanned themselves, but the movement only stirred the smells around the room. Men removed their gloves to wipe sweat, while women shifted uncomfortably under their layers of fabric. Yet none of this discomfort was spoken of openly. To criticise a lady's scent was to breach decorum, even if the stench was overwhelming. The women themselves often had no idea how strong the odour became. They believed that the flowers and sachets were doing their work. Friends complimented one another on their appearance, and silence kept the truth hidden. But anyone seated nearby could not escape the result. The mingling of sweat, mould, and perfume filled the lungs of the audience as surely as smoke filled the streets outside. If we compared this to modern times, it would be like walking into a cinema where every seat cushion had been soaked in spoiled milk and then sprayed with cheap perfume. For the poorer women, the problem was worse. They could not afford finer fabrics or frequent laundering. Their dresses were made of wool or heavy cotton, which absorbed sweat quickly and held it. Adding flowers was their only attempt at elegance, but the practice backfired. By the end of an evening, their clothes carried the smell of both labour and decay. Theatres that sought to represent refinement were filled instead with a mixture of foulness rising from hundreds of bodies packed close together. I find it disturbing to picture rows of smiling women, proud in their finery, while the air around them grew so foul that others collapsed. It was not malice, not neglect, but ignorance shaped by shame. Cleanliness was expected, yet the means to achieve it were out of reach. Covering the problem with flowers seemed clever, but it only created new dangers. The fainting in theatres was a visible reminder of what society preferred not to see. The incident in 1874 was not unique. Newspapers occasionally reported cases of fainting in crowded halls, attributing them to weak nerves, overexcitement, or poor ventilation. Rarely did they point directly to the odour rising from gowns. To admit such a cause would expose too much, suggesting that the very symbols of refinement were hiding filth. Instead, the myth of delicate constitutions continued, protecting social appearances while ignoring the reality. Inside the homes of these women, the problem began long before the theatre. Dresses were seldom washed because of their bulk and cost. Layers of undergarments absorbed sweat but were reused repeatedly without proper cleaning. Flowers and sachets were added each day, pressed deeper into folds that were already damp. By the time the evening performance began, the dresses carried weeks of accumulated decay. The heat of the crowd simply released it into the air. This detail of Victorian life reveals a pattern repeated in many areas. Appearance mattered more than truth, and solutions that seemed elegant often carried hidden harm. Theatres stood as symbols of culture, but inside them, the smell of rot betrayed the fragility of those symbols. The collapse of a woman in her seat was not just a personal misfortune, but a reflection of how society's habits turned refinement into risk. The gowns filled with flowers that turned sour created suffocating odours, strong enough to overwhelm and even cause fainting in public halls. What looked like refinement was in truth a slow fermentation of sweat and petals sealed in heavy fabric. The discomfort was ignored, and the fainting dismissed, but the problem lingered, carried forward into every gathering. From the theatre to the drawing room, the same unwashed clothes spread their hidden dangers. The garments closest to a Victorian woman's skin were rarely spoken of but always present. Beneath the silk, cotton, and lace that met the eye lay underlayers of wool, most often coarse linen or heavy flannel. These garments clung to the body every day, absorbing sweat, oil, and dirt from skin that was seldom washed. Women wore 3, sometimes 5 layers of clothing, and the inner layer of wool was in constant contact with their flesh. It trapped heat in winter and soaked through in summer, yet it was almost never laundered. Instead of washing, women hung the wool to dry, allowing moisture to evaporate but leaving behind everything else. Over time, the fabric became stiff, sour, and alive with bacteria. Wool has natural properties that make it both durable and insulating. It was valued because it held its shape and protected against the cold. But the same fibres that made it resilient also made it an excellent sponge for odour. Sweat absorbed into wool did not easily wash out, even when water was used. In homes where water was scarce and soap expensive, true washing was avoided. Women believed airing garments near a fire or in the open air was enough. The smell might lessen, but the bacteria remained. Each time the garment touched the skin again, the cycle of irritation and infection grew worse. The smell of such undergarments was described in some accounts as unbearable, especially when women gathered in close spaces. Doctors and reformers who visited poor neighbourhoods noted the strong, sour odour that clung to households. This odour came not only from bodies but from the layers of wool that had not been cleaned in months, sometimes years. The garments fermented slowly, like damp cloth left in a cellar. What looked like refinement on the surface dresses of bright colours, polished shoes hid rot underneath. It almost sounds absurd that women thought they could present elegance while carrying wool soaked in months of sweat under their gowns. For women, the irritation of wearing unwashed wool was constant. Rashes spread across thighs and stomachs, especially in summer when sweat was heavy. The fabric rubbed against skin, leaving raw patches that never had a chance to heal. Infections found easy entry through these wounds, abscesses developed, and the pain was ignored until it became severe. Women were expected to endure discomfort in silence. To complain about the state of their undergarments would be to admit a lack of refinement, so they said nothing. The custom of layering worsened the problem. Each additional skirt trapped heat and moisture, pressing the wool closer to the body. Air could not circulate, and the weight of the fabric prevented skin from drying. In winter, this meant constant dampness, which led to chills and respiratory sickness. In summer, it meant unbearable heat, prickly rashes, and sores that spread beneath clothing. The smell followed women everywhere, though society's strict manners meant few dared to mention it aloud. If we compare it to modern times, it would be like wearing the same pair of gym clothes every day for months, never washing them, only letting them air out in the corner of a room. The thought is disgusting, yet in Victorian households, it was not considered unusual. Laundry was laborious and expensive. Wool was heavy, slow to dry, and difficult to scrub clean. Many believed it would ruin the fabric to wash it too often, so they avoided the task entirely. Servants bore the worst of this routine. They were responsible for hanging the garments to dry, sometimes catching the overwhelming odour in small, damp rooms. They too wore wool, passed down from their employers, even more worn and rarely washed. Their work required heavy labour, which meant more sweat, more dirt, and greater irritation. When they fell ill with infections of the skin or lungs, it was treated as weakness rather than the result of clothing that acted as a breeding ground for bacteria. I cannot help but think how cruel it must have been to live under these standards, expected to look elegant in public while enduring the misery of sores and foul smells in private. The hypocrisy of the age is striking. Society prized appearances, yet its women carried hidden burdens that ate away at their health. The wool that kept them warm also poisoned their skin day by day. Inside homes, the ritual of hanging wool to dry was treated as enough. Women draped garments near fireplaces, hoping the smoke would cleanse them. Others placed them by open windows, trusting fresh air to do the work. Neither method removed the build-up of sweat and dirt embedded deep in the fibres. The garments stiffened, turned yellow, and carried stains that never left. When finally discarded, they were often handed down to servants or poorer relatives, spreading the problem further. Doctors who saw cases of chronic skin infections sometimes noted the connection to unwashed clothing, but their voices carried little influence. The idea that garments themselves could cause illness was unfamiliar. Most preferred to blame weak constitutions, poor diets, or simple misfortune. Without clear knowledge of germs, the obvious link remained invisible. The wool was accepted as necessary, part of a woman's life, no matter what it did to her body. Social gatherings magnified the issue, in parlors, theatres, or churches. The air was thick with the combined odour of hundreds of women wearing the same unwashed garments. Fainting spells were attributed to poor ventilation or delicate nerves. Rarely did anyone dare suggest that the dresses themselves were to blame. Respectability required silence, even as the smell became overwhelming. This silence allowed the practice to continue without challenge. This detail of daily life shows the contradiction of the Victorian world. The same society that celebrated morality and discipline tolerated habits that spread illness and decay. Women's suffering was hidden under the weight of fabric, their pain dismissed as natural. The wool that should have offered comfort became instead a carrier of infection. It was an ordinary object turned dangerous through neglect and ignorance. The woolen undergarments worn daily by Victorian women absorbed sweat, odours, and bacteria until they became sources of illness. They were never washed, only aired, and so they carried infection from one day to the next. What seemed like thrift and propriety was in reality a dangerous routine that spread rashes, sores, and disease. The hidden risks did not end with clothing, however. because even the utensils used for bathing crossed into the world of food, turning hygiene into a direct path towards sickness. The cooking pot was one of the most important objects in a Victorian home. It was the vessel in which porridge was boiled, soups were stirred, and bread was steamed. Yet in many poorer households, that same pot was also used to heat water for bathing. Fuel was costly, and families owned only a few large vessels. To them, it seemed practical to use one pot for every need. After the water cooled and was poured into a tub, the pot was left with traces of skin, dirt, and even clumps of hair. By morning it would be back on the fire, filled with oats or broth, ready to feed the entire family. The practice seemed like common sense at the time. Tools were scarce, and water was heavy to carry. A single large pot was a family's lifeline, so it had to serve every purpose. No one saw the danger in boiling bath water in the same pot used for food. Boiling was thought to cleanse, but in reality, not everything was destroyed. Dirt stuck to the metal, oily scum clung to the sides, and scraps from skin or nails remained. When food was prepared in the same pot, all of these traces joined it unseen. The result was contamination that spread silently. Families ate porridge flavoured not only by oats, but by whatever the bath had left behind. A toenail scraped into the water, a patch of dead skin softened by heat, or a sore washed clean of pus. All of it found its way back into mouths the next day. It almost sounds absurd that families thought boiling away the grime was enough, as if a few bubbles could erase filth. But in Victorian homes where money was short, no one imagined they had a choice. This habit was especially dangerous when someone had wounds or skin infections. Open sores leaked bacteria into the bath water. Once the water was emptied, the residue clung stubbornly to the pot. The next morning, broth ladled from the same vessel carried invisible threats straight into the stomachs of children. Illness followed quickly, often with vomiting, cramps, and fever. Parents rarely connected the sickness to the pot. They assumed weak bodies or bad luck were to blame. The kitchens of poor households were cramped, with little space for separation. Food preparation, laundry, and bathing often overlapped. The pot at the centre of the room carried the marks of every task. Its blackened sides bore scratches from spoons, knives, and nails alike. The smell of cooked grain mingled with the sour odour of used bath water. Families accepted this as ordinary. They did not see contamination, only practicality. Markets offered no easy solution. Large pots were expensive, and few could afford more than one. Soap strong enough to scrub away grease and bacteria was also costly. Many families wiped their pots with rags or rinsed them briefly with water, believing this was enough. In truth, the rags themselves were often filthy, spreading bacteria further. The pot never truly became clean. If we compare this to modern life, it would be like washing dirty socks in the same blender used later to make a smoothie. The thought is revolting now, but to Victorians it was simply life. The danger was not just in the pot, but in the culture of silence around hygiene. Speaking of dirt was considered rude, and many believed that what could not be seen did not matter. Women carried the burden of maintaining the household, yet they lacked knowledge and resources. They repeated the practices their mothers had taught them, unaware that they were carrying illness forward. Each meal seemed nourishing, but hidden within it was the residue of the previous night's bath. I find it deeply troubling to picture children eating from bowls filled with porridge cooked in the same pot that had held their family's dirty bathwater hours earlier. It is not just the physical filth that shocks, but the thought of how normal it was considered. The families did not mean harm. They acted from necessity, trying to stretch their few possessions as far as possible. Poverty left them no safer choice. Outbreaks of stomach illness were common. Diarrhea, vomiting, and fevers swept through neighbourhoods, claiming lives silently. Doctors treated the symptoms but rarely traced the cause back to cooking pots. Without knowledge of bacteria, they blamed spoiled food or weak constitutions. The true culprit remained hidden in plain sight. blackened by fire and filled each day with new dangers. Inside the homes, the cycle repeated endlessly. Bath water by night, porridge by morning, stew by evening. The pot was never empty for long. It carried the weight of every meal and every body, absorbing traces of both. Families trusted it, never questioning what it carried forward. To them, it was not a source of sickness, but a symbol of survival. This detail shows how deeply intertwined necessity and danger were in Victorian life. The poor made do with what they had, and what they had betrayed them. The very object that kept families alive with food also brought them to sickness. It was an ordinary item turned into a silent agent of disease, not through neglect, but through desperation. The use of one pot for both bathing and cooking spread illness directly into the mouths of families, disguising contamination as nourishment. They trusted the vessel that fed them, never realizing it carried infection from body to body. As meals passed from kitchen to table, another risk was already waiting in the same households, carried not in food but in the unwashed hands that touched children each day. A mother's hands were the most trusted tools in a Victorian household. They fed children, dressed them, and soothed them when they cried. Yet those same hands often carried dangers no one could see. After changing a soiled cloth or wiping a child, many mothers went directly to feeding without washing. Soap was absent in most homes, and water alone was thought sufficient if it was used at all. What seemed like ordinary care became a hidden pathway for sickness, moving silently from hand to mouth. The idea of germs was not widely understood. Most families believed that dirt was visible, and if nothing could be seen, nothing harmful remained. The natural scent of the body was considered harmless, even healthy. Mothers did not think twice about preparing porridge immediately after touching waste. A baby held close was fed with the same hands that had just cleaned filth. No one suspected that those hands were carrying invisible threats into fragile bodies. The consequences were severe. Infants and young children were especially vulnerable. Their small stomachs and weak immune systems could not fight the bacteria passed into their mouths. Diarrhea struck quickly, leaving children weak, dehydrated, and feverish. Many never recovered. Records from the time show that infants died more often at home than in hospitals, not because hospitals were unsafe, but because at least some cleanliness was enforced there. It almost feels grimly ironic that the same hands meant to nourish a child were also delivering the poison that killed them. The lack of soap was central to the problem. Even when families owned a bar, it was often saved for laundry or special occasions. Everyday tasks were done with bare rinsing. If that, water used for cleaning might itself be drawn from contaminated wells, adding more bacteria rather than removing it. The notion of scrubbing hands between tasks simply did not exist. Mothers moved from one duty to another without pause, carrying traces of waste into every corner of the home. In cramped kitchens and nurseries, the risks multiplied. A mother wiped a baby, rinsed the cloth in a basin, then reached for a spoon to feed another child. The same spoon might be licked clean, wiped on a sleeve, and used again. Family members shared cups and bowls, spreading bacteria further. Each small act seemed ordinary, but together they created a cycle of infection that devastated households. If we compared this to modern life, it would be like preparing an infant's bottle immediately after handling raw sewage, with no thought of washing in between. Mothers carried guilt when children grew sick, but they rarely knew the cause. They blamed weak constitutions, bad air, or fate. When several children in a neighbourhood died in the same week, families believed it was misfortune, not shared practices. Few imagined that their own hands were the bridge between waste and food. The silence around hygiene meant the pattern continued unchecked, generation after generation. I find it heartbreaking to imagine mothers holding their infants close, believing they were offering safety, while unknowingly passing on the very illness that would take them away. It was not neglect, but ignorance, enforced by poverty and tradition. The knowledge that could have saved lives was not available to them. Instead, grief became a routine part of motherhood, accepted as unavoidable. The numbers were staggering. Infant mortality was high across Victorian society, but among the poor, it was catastrophic. Homes without soap, with limited water, and with no awareness of germs became breeding grounds for illness. Doctors who studied the problem saw the connection but struggled to convince others. Advice about washing hands was often dismissed as unnecessary or even insulting. Cleanliness was thought of as a matter of appearance, not as protection from disease. Inside households, mothers did what they thought was best. They rocked their babies, spooned broth into their mouths, and wiped their faces with the same hands that had just cleaned waste. Each gesture was an act of love wrapped in risk. Families buried child after child, believing that God or chance had taken them, while the truth lay in habits repeated daily. This detail of life exposes the cruel divide of the age. Wealthier families, with servants and better access to water, had slightly lower rates of infant death. Poor families suffered endlessly, their children falling ill in numbers too high to ignore. Yet society accepted these deaths as natural, another cost of poverty. The mothers themselves were never told that the answer lay in something as simple as soap and water. The story of unwashed hands is not just about hygiene. It is about silence, ignorance, and the weight of poverty pressing down on the most ordinary acts of care. Mothers gave all they had, but their lack of knowledge turned love into danger. The hands that should have guarded life became the carriers of death, unseen and unacknowledged. The unwashed hands of Victorian mothers carried bacteria from waste to food, making infants sick and leading to countless deaths at home. What appeared to be tender care was in truth the hidden cause of suffering. As children grew, another danger awaited them, clinging not to hands but to the very clothes their mothers wore as they walked the filthy streets. The dresses worn by Victorian women were not like garments that brushed the ankles. They were long, layered, and heavy, designed to drag across the ground. Hemlines swept the streets, dipping into mud, dust, and the waste left behind by animals and people alike. In crowded markets, the cloth touched rotting vegetables, spilled milk, and the slime of fishmongers' stalls. In public latrines, it brushed against puddles of urine and streaks of human filth. Each step gathered a new layer of contamination. Yet when the women returned home, they carried these same skirts across parlors and bedrooms, pressing them into chairs, sofas, and beds. What looked like elegance in the street became an invisible flood of bacteria inside the home. The construction of these dresses made them especially dangerous. Multiple layers of fabric meant that dirt did not simply fall away. Moisture clung to the wool and cotton, seeping into the weave, and remained trapped there. Once the fabric dried, the marks were less visible, but the bacteria remained. The hems became darkened, stiff, and foul-smelling. Yet laundering such massive garments was rare. Washing took time, fuel, and labour that many households could not spare. Instead, skirts were shaken out at the door or hung briefly in fresh air before being worn again. This practice meant that the very symbols of refinement acted as carriers of disease. In drawing rooms where families gathered, skirts spread whatever they had collected across upholstered furniture. Infants crawled on rugs that had been brushed by hems soaked in the filth of city streets. Husbands leaned against fabric that had touched latrine floors. No one recognized the risk because the contamination was invisible. It almost sounds laughable that the most fashionable dresses were also the dirtiest rags in the city. Public spaces were full of hazards. Streets were rarely cleaned, and animals left waste everywhere. Markets overflowed with spoiled produce. Human sewage drained poorly, leaving puddles that never dried. Long skirts acted like sponges, gathering everything the city dropped. Even wealthy women who prided themselves on dignity returned home with skirts heavy with filth. Poorer women, who spent more time outdoors, carried even more. The infection did not stop at the doorstep. It came inside with every fold of cloth. Children paid a high price. They clung to their mothers' skirts or sat in their laps, pressing their faces against fabric soaked in germs. They sucked their thumbs after handling cloth that had been dragged through gutters. Stomach illnesses spread quickly in such homes, leaving children weak and dehydrated. Parents rarely suspected the skirts. They blamed bad luck or weak constitutions, never realizing that the disease had been carried in on hems brushing the ground. The smell of these garments was often overwhelming. Observers noted that gatherings of women created a mix of odours, sweat, perfume, and the sour stench of fabric steeped in waste. Theatres and churches were thick with it, though etiquette forbade anyone from mentioning it aloud. Ventilation was poor, so the stench lingered, clinging to every surface. Still, the dresses were admired for their volume and elegance. The irony was complete society praised the very garments that brought sickness into its most private spaces. If we compare this habit to modern life, it would be like mopping the floor of a public restroom with a long towel and then spreading that towel across the family sofa. The absurdity is clear now, but in Victorian times, no one thought this strange. The standards of fashion demanded long skirts, and women obeyed. Few questioned how those skirts functioned as carriers of disease. I find it chilling to picture women settling into bed, still wearing garments that had just been dragged through streets smeared with human waste. They believed they were respectable, clean, and proper, even while lying in fabric steeped in filth. The blindness was not chosen. It was created by ignorance, by poverty, and by rigid standards that valued appearance above safety. The danger extended beyond homes. In hospitals, where cleanliness should have mattered most, nurses wore long skirts as well. These garments brushed against sick beds, picked up fluids, and carried them to other patients. Infection spread silently, aided by uniforms designed for modesty rather than hygiene. Doctors noted the high rates of cross-contamination, but did not always understand the role of clothing. The hemline, considered a symbol of dignity, was in fact a vector of disease. Even among the wealthy, who owned more garments and had servants to clean them, the problem remained. Laundering was still infrequent, and the skirts still touched the same filthy streets. Servants tasked with shaking out or brushing down the garments often became ill themselves, breathing in dust filled with waste. They had no choice but to handle the fabrics daily, carrying risks into their own lives. The persistence of this habit shows how deeply fashion could override practicality. Women were judged by their appearance, not their health. To wear shorter skirts was to risk shame, as it suggested poverty or immorality. So they endured the weight, the odour, and the danger, never questioning why refinement had to mean filth. Reformers spoke of improving sanitation in streets and water supplies, but they rarely mentioned clothing. The problem remained invisible, even while it touched every household. Over time, the unwashed skirts contributed to widespread illness. Outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and dysentery spread rapidly in urban neighbourhoods. Families wondered how the disease reached them when they had never left home, not realising that it had arrived on the hem of their own garments. The skirts acted as mobile carriers, sweeping up germs from the city and depositing them in parlours, kitchens, and bedrooms. The detail of long skirts dragging across filth reveals once again the contradictions of Victorian life. A society obsessed with propriety created habits that undermined its health. Women bore the weight of these contradictions literally on their bodies, walking with pride in garments that quietly endangered their families. The skirts represented status and refinement, yet they were more dangerous than any visible dirt. The heavy skirts of Victorian women swept up filth from streets and latrines, carrying it into homes and spreading illness without anyone realising. They were praised as fashionable but functioned as tools of infection. From skirts dragging through waste, another danger waited in the world of fashion itself: hidden not in fabric but in the false beauty of cosmetics designed to frame the eyes. False eyelashes in Victorian times were nothing like the carefully manufactured products sold today. They were crude, heavy, and often attached to substances that would horrify a modern reader. Women sought to make their eyes appear larger and more dramatic, following a growing fashion that linked long lashes with innocence and beauty. To achieve this look, they glued strands of human hair or animal fur onto their eyelids. The lashes themselves were unsanitary, sometimes collected from barbers' floors or from old wigs. Yet the real danger was not the lashes but the glue. One of the most common adhesives used at the time was melted fat taken from dead rats. It was cheap, sticky, and widely available, but it carried with it contamination and rot. The process of creating this glue was simple and disgusting. Rat carcasses were collected, and their bodies were boiled down until the fat floated to the surface. The fat was skimmed off, cooled, and stored for later use. Mixed with other ingredients, it became a thick paste applied directly to the eyelids. Women smeared this near the delicate tissue of the eye, trusting it to hold the lashes in place. The smell was unpleasant, but perfume or scented powders were often added to disguise it. Fashion overruled caution. It is almost darkly amusing that refinement in Victorian society sometimes meant rubbing decomposed rat fat onto one's eyelids. The eyes are among the most vulnerable parts of the body. The skin around them is thin, and the surface of the eye is easily scratched. Once contaminated glue was applied, infection often followed. Women developed redness, swelling, and burning sensations almost immediately. Yet these were dismissed as normal side effects of beauty. The lashes were heavy, pulling at the lids, making the eyes water constantly. Many assumed this discomfort was the price of fashion. In truth, they were exposing themselves to severe infections that could lead to permanent damage. Cases of keratitis, an inflammation of the cornea, became common. Doctors noted women arriving with inflamed, clouded eyes after using false lashes. Pus gathered at the corners, vision blurred, and in the worst cases, blindness followed. Still, the practice continued. No laws prevented the sale of dangerous cosmetics, and the women who suffered were often blamed for their own vanity. The cycle of harm repeated itself as sellers moved from district to district, promising beauty with every jar of glue. The irony was harsh. The empire celebrated progress in medicine and science, yet women were gluing rotting animal fat to their eyelids. There were no safety standards, no product testing, no protection. The fashion industry operated in the shadows, producing goods that appealed to appearances while ignoring health. A woman might look elegant at a gathering, her lashes long and dark, but by morning her eyes could be swollen shut. If we compared this to today, it would be like attaching false lashes with glue made from spoiled meat fat sold on a street corner. The problem was not limited to the glue. The lashes themselves carried risks. Hair was rarely cleaned before being reused. Strands might come from wigs, barbershops, or even animals freshly skinned. Dust, lice, and bacteria clung to them. Once pressed against the eyelid, they introduced further contamination. Women thought they were enhancing beauty, but they were in fact attaching small colonies of germs directly to their faces. I cannot help but feel a deep unease imagining women staring into mirrors, carefully applying lashes while unknowingly placing infection so close to their vision. The image is haunting because it was not a rare act. It was part of everyday life for those who wished to meet the strict beauty standards of their time. They had no reason to think the lashes were dangerous, only reason to fear being judged without them. The practice also revealed social divides. Wealthier women could afford professionally prepared lashes and glues, though these were hardly safer. Poorer women made do with whatever they could find. Some concocted their own adhesives from animal fat mixed with resin, boiling scraps in kitchens already full of filth. Others bought cheap bundles of hair sold in markets without asking where they came from. In both cases, the results were the same: red eyes, infection, and often long-term damage. Doctors who treated these conditions sometimes wrote reports, but their warnings were drowned out by the booming trade in beauty. Fashion magazines continued to promote long lashes as a mark of elegance. Illustrations showed women with dark, dramatic eyes, without mention of the cost. Beauty was equated with morality and status, and so women risked their health to achieve it. Blindness was a private tragedy, never linked publicly to cosmetics. Inside homes, the application of false lashes was often a social act. Women gathered around mirrors, helping one another press the strips into place. The laughter and conversation masked the dangers. They admired the effect, ignoring the irritation that came within minutes. Infection spread not only from glue but from shared tools pins, brushes, and jars of adhesive handled by many hands. Each gathering became another step in the spread of eye disease. The story of these lashes reflects the broader truth of Victorian hygiene. Appearances mattered above all else, while safety was disregarded. Women carried the heaviest burden, expected to embody refinement even at the cost of their own health. Their eyes, windows to their dignity and beauty, were sacrificed to standards that rewarded pain. False eyelashes glued with rat fat caused infections, swelling, and blindness, yet they were accepted as normal tools of beauty. Women believed they were achieving elegance, while in reality, they were risking their sight with every application. The danger hidden in lashes was just one part of a larger pattern. For even the shops that sold them would later become the centre of another tragedy when entire communities fell ill from contaminated cosmetics. In the year 1882, doctors at a London eye clinic recorded a disturbing trend. Women arrived with swollen eyelids, clouded vision, and sharp pain that would not ease. What began as irritation after applying false lashes quickly grew into infections that spread from one patient to the next. Soon, the cases were so numerous that physicians realized they were facing not isolated incidents, but the beginnings of an outbreak. The lashes in question all came from the same market stall in Camden, a place where cheap cosmetics were sold openly, without oversight or concern for safety. The stall offered bundles of false lashes that looked clean enough from a distance. Strips of hair, dark and even, were displayed in small boxes, ready to be glued onto lids. Women seeking the fashionable wide-eyed look bought them eagerly. They were inexpensive, making them accessible even to those with little money. But the lashes were far from safe. Many had been gathered without care, some from wigs, some from animals, and others from human hair that was never sanitized. Lice clung to the strands, and dust filled the spaces between them. Yet no one questioned the source. Appearance mattered more than origin. Once glued onto the lids, the danger grew. The glue itself was often contaminated, made from animal fat or other unstable mixtures. Women pressed the lashes into place, unaware that lice were still crawling in the fibres. The result was a perfect storm of irritation and infection. Within days, eyelids swelled, vision blurred, and in some cases, pus began to seep from the corners of the eyes. The pain was intense, but vanity kept many from admitting what caused it. They returned again and again to the same stall, repeating the mistake that blinded them. One case stood out in the clinic records. A woman arrived with one eye so severely infected that doctors could do nothing to save it. The infection had eaten into the cornea, leaving her blind on one side. She had glued a strip of lashes directly onto an eyelid already infested with lice. The combined damage was too much. Her story spread quietly, but it did not stop others. Fashion was a stronger force than fear. It almost seems absurd that women trusted street stalls for items placed directly onto their eyes, the most delicate organs they had. The outbreak grew because the lashes were shared among friends. Women often bought one set and split it, or borrowed them from one another at gatherings. They applied them with the same glue, dipped brushes into the same jars, and handled them with unwashed hands. Infection moved from one face to another with ease. The Camden stall became infamous in medical circles. though it continued to thrive among customers who ignored the warnings. Doctors struggled to spread awareness. Germ theory was still new, and many resisted the idea that invisible agents caused disease. Some believed the infections were a sign of weak nerves or poor blood, not contaminated lashes. The sellers denied responsibility, insisting their products were harmless. Without laws to control cosmetics, the trade carried on unchecked. Women who lost their sight were treated as victims of fate rather than of negligence. The contrast with modern expectations is striking. If we compared this to today, it would be like dozens of people losing their vision after buying counterfeit contact lenses from a street vendor. The thought is shocking, but in Victorian London, it was accepted as part of daily life. Cheap goods were always risky, but poverty left people with little choice. Beauty standards were relentless, and women felt compelled to meet them regardless of the danger. I find it unsettling to imagine a market stall surrounded by eager customers, while only a few streets away, doctors treated women blinded by the very products sold there. The disconnect between the marketplace and the clinic shows how society failed to protect its women. Commerce thrived, while health suffered in silence. Inside homes, the damage lingered. Women with partial vision struggled to care for their families. Some could no longer work, leaving their households poorer. Blindness was permanent, and the scars it left were not just physical but social. Yet the practice of buying cheap lashes did not disappear. The promise of beauty outweighed the memory of harm. The cycle of damage continued, hidden beneath the surface of polite society. This outbreak at Camden was a clear warning of the dangers of unregulated beauty products. It revealed how easily fashion could turn into tragedy, and how quickly harm could spread when ignorance met vanity. Yet the warning went largely unheeded. False lashes remained popular, and sellers found new ways to disguise their products, keeping customers coming back. The cost was measured not only in coins but in sight lost forever. The lashes sold at Camden Market in 1882 spread infection, blinded women, and exposed the lack of protection for consumers. They showed how dangerous beauty routines had become, even as society praised refinement, while lashes destroyed vision. Another threat lay hidden in fabrics closer to the body, in the cloths women used each month and dried secretly in the most dangerous corners of their homes. The clothes used by Victorian women during menstruation were thick, rough pieces of fabric meant to absorb what they could. Unlike the disposable products of today, these cloths were reused month after month. After being soaked with blood, they were rinsed briefly in well water, often without soap. The stains never fully came out, and the fabric quickly grew stiff and sour. Yet they were kept because there was no alternative. The task was considered private, even shameful, so women avoided speaking of it. What happened in silence carried dangers that touched not just the women themselves, but entire households. The drying of these cloths was one of the greatest risks. Out of fear of embarrassment, women rarely hung them outside in the open air. Instead, they dried them indoors, hidden in corners of kitchens or in damp attics. These were the warmest and most private spaces, but they were also the most dangerous. Kitchens filled with steam from cooking, and attics trapped moisture from the air. Both created the perfect environment for mold. Spores grew quickly, spreading across the damp cloth, invisible at first and then showing as dark stains. Still, the clothes were folded and used again the next month. Women believed they were being discreet, protecting their dignity. Society encouraged this silence, teaching that menstruation should remain hidden. No one taught them about germs or infection. The clothes looked passable once dried, even if they smelled faintly of mildew. Women accepted discomfort as natural. Rashes, itching, and pain were endured quietly. Few realized these were not ordinary symptoms, but signs of infection growing worse with every cycle. It seems almost ridiculous that modesty forced women to dry blood-soaked cloths beside their family's food instead of in clean air. The infections that followed were serious. Bacteria enter through small cuts or sores, travelling deeper into the body. Women developed pelvic pain, abnormal discharges, and fevers. In many cases, infections spread to the uterus and beyond, leading to infertility or even death. Doctors who treated these conditions often could not trace the cause. They blamed weak bodies or immoral behaviour, never suspecting the hidden practices around menstrual cloths. Meanwhile, the routine continued, month after month, with each use adding more risk. The kitchens where clothes were hidden carried additional hazards. Food prepared in the same space absorbed spores from damp fabrics drying nearby. Families ate meals cooked beneath hanging rags stained with blood and mould. The air was heavy with steam, carrying spores into lungs and onto dishes. Illness spread not only to women but to children and men who never knew the source. The line between food and waste blurred, all in the name of secrecy. If we compared this to modern life, it would be like storing used medical bandages above the family dining table, then reusing them again without sterilisation. The comparison makes the danger clear, but in Victorian homes, it was simply life. Women had no other choice. Manufactured products did not exist, and the shame surrounding menstruation made them hide even the little they did. Poverty deepened the problem, as families could not afford enough fabric to rotate or clean properly. I find it unsettling to imagine women quietly folding away clothes that they knew smelled foul, convincing themselves it was normal. They had no other model to follow. Their mothers had done the same, and their daughters would continue the practice. It was not neglect but necessity, shaped by ignorance and silence. Each infection was treated as fate rather than a consequence. The attic, another common drying place, was no safer. There, the air was still, and the dampness from roofs that leaked in the rain kept everything moist. Mice and insects crawled freely, leaving droppings that mingled with the fabric. Women returned later to collect the clothes, brushing off dust and thinking little of it. The next month, they placed the same clothes against their skin. The cycle of contamination was complete. Doctors in hospitals sometimes noticed patterns. Women arrived with recurring fevers and abdominal pain, their bodies too weak to recover. Post-mortem examinations occasionally revealed infections that had spread far beyond the uterus, yet the cause remained obscured by silence. Few patients admitted to their menstrual practices, and fewer still were asked. The cultural taboo ensured that the true danger stayed hidden in kitchens and attics, never spoken of in public. The damage extended beyond individual illness. High rates of maternal mortality were influenced by these infections, as women entered childbirth already weakened. Some became sterile long before their time, unable to have children, and were treated as failures by society. Their suffering was blamed on destiny rather than the practices forced on them by ignorance and poverty. The injustice was profound, but it remained invisible. The story of reused menstrual cloths shows how a society that prided itself on morality ignored the basic needs of its women. Secrecy was valued more than health, and modesty became a weapon of harm. Women followed traditions that betrayed their bodies, while the world around them looked away. The clothes represented more than hygiene. They were symbols of silence, shame, and the quiet suffering hidden inside every home. The clothes used month after month, dried in kitchens and attics, carried spores and bacteria that caused infections of the womb and beyond. They poisoned women slowly, leaving scars that could not be seen. What appeared to be modesty and thrift was in fact a practice of hidden disease. As women endured these cycles of harm, another danger lay waiting in the very fabric of the undergarments they wore daily, stitched together from materials never meant for human skin. The undergarments of poor Victorian women were not made of fine linen or soft cotton. Many had no access to such fabrics. Instead, they turned to whatever material was available and affordable. One common choice was sackcloth, a rough fabric once used to hold potatoes, barley, or other grains. When the sacks grew too worn for storage, they were cut apart and stitched into crude garments. These makeshift undergarments were harsh against the skin, carrying the smells and stains of the food they once held. Traces of spoiled grain, dirt, and mould clung to the fibres, yet in households where every coin mattered, such cloth was reused without thought for the danger it carried. The fabric itself was coarse. Rubbing constantly against sensitive skin caused chafing and rawness. Sweat mixed with the leftover powders of grain, creating a paste that irritated further. In many cases, the sacks had never been properly cleaned before being repurposed. Women slipped them on, feeling discomfort but believing it to be natural. Pain was accepted as part of life, and modesty demanded that no one speak of it. Beneath the heavy dresses and skirts, skin broke down slowly, inviting infection. Moisture was a constant problem. In the damp climate of Victorian towns, sackcloth absorbed sweat and held it close to the body. Spores of mould thrived in this warmth. What began as itching soon developed into rashes and open sores. These infections spread across the vulva and inner thighs, making daily tasks painful. Yet women rarely sought help. Doctors were expensive, and subjects related to reproductive health were considered shameful. Silence kept them suffering in private. It is bitterly ironic that garments meant to cover and protect instead became carriers of disease. The smell of these undergarments told its own story. Even when washed, they retained the sour odour of spoiled food. Women sometimes sprinkled powders or stuffed herbs between layers of clothing to mask it, but the stench of mould and sweat returned quickly. In crowded homes, the smell blended with the air of damp kitchens and narrow rooms. Families were accustomed to it, hardly noticing. Still, the hidden cloth carried its poison against the skin every hour of the day. The infections were not mild irritations. They often spread inward, causing pain that made walking and sitting difficult. Some women developed chronic discharges, fevers, and pelvic inflammation. In severe cases, untreated infections led to infertility or systemic illness. Yet the cause remained hidden. Few suspected that the very fabric worn closest to the body was responsible. The roughness of life was blamed, never the roughness of sackcloth. If we compared this to modern times, it would be like making underwear from discarded food packaging still coated in mould, and then wearing it daily against bare skin. The idea sounds unthinkable, but in Victorian society it was a necessity. Poverty allowed no other choice. When every scrap of fabric had value, nothing was wasted, not even sacks once filled with rotting grain. I find it deeply unsettling to picture women sewing late into the night, cutting old sacks into strips, believing they were being resourceful while unknowingly preparing a source of infection. Their work was an act of survival, but it brought harm disguised as thrift. The burden of poverty pressed so heavily that safety was sacrificed without hesitation. Servants and labourers suffered the most. Unlike wealthier women, they owned few garments and rotated them rarely. One set of sackcloth underwear might be worn for weeks before being rinsed in cold water and put back on. The coarse fibres grew stiff and rougher with time, scraping the skin until it bled. Laundry itself was labour-intensive, requiring hauling water, heating it, and scrubbing by hand. For many families, washing undergarments thoroughly was a luxury they could not afford. Doctors who examined these cases often misunderstood them. When women sought help for sores or discharges, physicians sometimes accused them of immorality. They suspected venereal disease rather than poor hygiene. This only deepened the shame, driving women to hide their conditions. True causes went unrecorded, and the cycle continued in silence. The medical ignorance of the time left countless women untreated or mistreated. Their dignity eroded alongside their health. The social expectations of modesty made matters worse. Women could not speak openly about their discomfort. Even with close family members, pain was borne in silence, hidden beneath layers of clothing. Men rarely knew the details of what their wives endured. generations of women passed down the same practices, teaching daughters to make use of every scrap of cloth. What they taught as frugality became a legacy of infection. This hidden detail of life illustrates the contradictions of Victorian society. Publicly, the era prided itself on morality, refinement, and progress. Privately, its poorest women wore rotting food sacks as undergarments. The empire built railways, factories, and palaces, yet half its population carried sickness in silence from the most intimate layers of clothing. Refinement was only surface deep, while beneath the surface lay suffering. The sackcloth undergarments of Victorian women carried mould, dirt, and grain dust directly against their skin, spreading infections that scarred their health for life. What seemed like economy and resourcefulness was, in truth, a practice of hidden harm. While these women endured pain in silence, hospitals began filling with patients suffering from sores and lesions that no treatment seemed to heal, all of them sharing the same secret burden of cheap cloth. In 1879, doctors at Whitechapel Hospital began to notice a troubling pattern. A steady stream of women arrived with sores, rashes, and infections in the most sensitive parts of their bodies. The women were not prostitutes, nor had they been involved in sexual encounters that might have explained such conditions according to the moral judgments of the time. They were housewives, servants, and factory workers, and yet they all carried the same painful symptoms. Their cases baffled some doctors, but others soon realized the cause lay not in behavior but in fabric. These women were wearing undergarments made from coarse sackcloth once used to store potatoes and other foodstuffs. The cheap cloth still carried spores of mould, dirt, and rot, and pressed daily against the body. It created a slow-moving epidemic. The hospital report described ward after ward filled with female patients. They complained of constant itching that grew worse at night, of burning pain when they moved, and of discharges that stained their clothes. Some had ulcers that would not heal. The air in the ward was heavy with the sour smell of infection, yet the women lay quietly, ashamed to speak of what afflicted them. Their silence mirrored the silence of their homes, where complaints about such matters were often dismissed or hidden. Only when the pain became unbearable did they finally seek medical help. Doctors who studied the problem quickly realized the women had something in common. They wore the same type of garments, stitched from old potato sacks. The rough material chafed the skin raw, and the mould within it introduced bacteria directly into the body. Poverty had forced them into this choice, and modesty had kept them from questioning it. The physicians could not ignore the evidence. As one report dryly noted, "We are facing an epidemic born not of immorality but of potato sacks." It almost sounds absurd that a staple food could become a cause of disease simply through the reuse of its packaging. The women themselves were confused and ashamed. Many insisted they had done nothing improper, yet still they suffered from what looked like venereal disease. The stigma was cruel. Husbands doubted their wives, families whispered behind closed doors, and the women carried the double burden of pain and suspicion. In truth, they were victims of poverty and ignorance. Their bodies had become battlegrounds where thrift turned into harm. The hospital attempted treatments. Poultices were applied, ointments rubbed into sores, and some women were prescribed rest in the wards. A few recovered temporarily, but many returned within weeks, reinfected by the same garments waiting at home. There was little chance of escape unless they could afford better cloth. But cheap cotton was scarce, and linen was beyond reach. Sackcloth remained the only option for many. The cycle of infection was as relentless as the poverty that created it. If we compared this to today, it would be like an entire ward of women hospitalized because they had been wearing underwear cut from moldy food packaging. The very thought is grotesque, yet it captures the reality of 1879. Fashion and hygiene were not luxuries available to everyone. For the poor, survival meant making do, even if it meant clothing themselves in materials never meant to touch human skin. I cannot help but feel a deep sadness imagining those hospital wards, filled with rows of women lying quietly, their dignity eroded by both illness and shame. They were not guilty of recklessness. They were simply trying to clothe themselves and their families with what little they had. Yet society judged them, doctors pitied them, and history largely forgot them. The epidemic revealed more than medical ignorance. It exposed the way Victorian society viewed women's health. When men fell ill in factories, their injuries were treated as consequences of labour. When women fell ill from clothing, their suffering was treated as a personal failing. The truth, that poverty itself was the root cause, was rarely acknowledged. Instead, the women bore the stigma in silence. The Whitechapel epidemic was not confined to the hospital walls. It spread through entire communities, wherever sackcloth garments were common. Women in factories whispered of itching that would not go away. Servants scratched discreetly while continuing their work. Mothers endured pain while caring for children. The shame surrounding such conditions meant they were rarely discussed openly, allowing the problem to persist unchecked. Doctors who dared to speak bluntly met resistance. Some colleagues dismissed their findings, unwilling to believe that clothing could cause such widespread harm. Others saw the problem but knew no solution. Even if they advised women to avoid sackcloth, what alternatives could they offer? Poverty ensured that the dangerous practice would continue. Without systemic change, the women had no escape. This episode demonstrates how something as ordinary as a potato sack could become an agent of disease. The fabric was designed to carry food, not to clothe people. Yet in Victorian London, necessity blurred the line between utility and harm. The poor were forced to recycle everything, even at the cost of their health. The epidemic was a direct result of inequality, where the wealthy dressed in fine fabrics, while the poor suffered in silence from the consequences of their rags. The hospital at Whitechapel became a symbol of this contradiction. Within its walls, women lay side by side, their conditions identical, their suffering unacknowledged by the society outside. The wards smelled of ointments, damp cloth, and festering wounds. Nurses tried to comfort the patients, but resources were scarce. Each bed told the same story of poverty turned into sickness. The epidemic of itching and sores among women in 1879 was not a matter of personal failing but of structural neglect. Sackcloth undergarments carried mould and bacteria that caused widespread infections, filling hospital wards with patients who had done nothing more than try to clothe themselves. What appeared to be simple thrift was in truth the seed of disease. While hospitals struggled to treat the outcomes, another danger was spreading through smaller, everyday gestures, carried not by cloth, but by the simplest movements of the hands. One of the smallest gestures of daily life in Victorian society carried some of the greatest risks. Women moved constantly between tasks, their hands touching doors, market stalls, coal bins, and children's clothes, with no habit of washing in between. Fingers collected dust, sweat, and bacteria from every surface. Then, when turning the page of a notebook, separating sheets of pastry, or tearing a loaf of bread, they moistened their fingertips with a quick lick. This gesture was so ordinary that no one thought twice about it. Yet each lick placed whatever had been gathered from the outside world directly into the mouth. It was a cycle repeated hundreds of times each week, spreading disease in ways invisible to those who lived through it. The absence of soap and running water magnified the danger. Households rarely had proper facilities for cleaning hands, and many believed that wiping on an apron or rinsing in cold water was enough. Germ theory was still debated, so the idea of invisible threats to the skin was not widely accepted. A fingertip that looked clean was assumed to be safe, but the streets of Victorian cities were lined with filth, from horse manure to spit, and every doorknob or banister carried traces of it. Women who licked their fingers carried cholera, typhoid, or staphylococcus into their own bodies without realizing it. The kitchen became one of the main stages for this practice. A woman preparing bread or pies needed to separate sheets of dough or peel parchment apart. With no water nearby, she wetted her fingers with saliva. Then she pressed the same fingers into the food that her family would later eat. Children, already vulnerable, consumed meals carrying bacteria passed along in this way. Illness spread within days, yet families thought nothing of it. The gesture was considered efficient, even clever, a quick way to handle stubborn materials. It is almost grimly funny that a society so proud of refinement relied on saliva as the main kitchen tool. The gesture extended beyond cooking. In homes, women flipped through account books, recipe notes, or hymnals by licking their fingers to grip each page. The books themselves were handled by many, absorbing dirt and grease from countless hands. Every lick drew that dirt into the mouth. In schools, teachers and pupils did the same, spreading infections through shared texts. The act was universal, linking public and private spaces in a chain of transmission no one recognized. If we compare this to modern habits, it would be like licking your fingers after touching the handle of a subway train and then using those fingers to serve food at dinner. The shock of such an image is obvious now, but in Victorian times it passed unnoticed. The gesture was so ingrained that even when doctors began to speak of hand-washing, few considered it necessary for ordinary acts like page-turning or food preparation. Cleanliness was equated with visible order, not with unseen precautions. I find it disturbing to imagine mothers in dim kitchens, licking their fingers before tearing bread for their children, believing they were being efficient while unknowingly feeding them infection. The picture shows how ignorance and routine combine to create danger disguised as care. No one intended harm, but the result was repeated outbreaks of stomach illness and fever. Reports from the time make clear how widespread the consequences were. Families were struck by recurring waves of diarrhea and vomiting. Children grew pale and weak, their bodies unable to fight the infections introduced so casually. Doctors often could not trace the source, since the gesture that caused it was too ordinary to notice. They blamed spoiled food or bad air, while the true culprit was saliva mixed with bacteria, transferred from hand to mouth and back to food. Markets added another layer to the risk. Women sampled goods by touching them, then licked their fingers before counting coins or adjusting clothing. Sellers did the same, moistening fingers before opening paper bags or wrapping purchases. Money, already filthy with the traces of countless hands, was passed back and forth, each coin carrying germs that saliva helped to spread further. The market became a web of infection, each exchange sealed with the small act of licking a finger. Inside hospitals, nurses and attendants repeated the gesture as they turned pages of records or separated bandages. The consequences were deadly, as infections moved from patient to patient through contaminated hands. Even as doctors slowly began to understand the importance of sanitation, this simple act was overlooked. It was too mundane, too ingrained, to be seen as dangerous. The persistence of the habit shows how small routines can shape public health. Women thought they were being practical, saving time in the kitchen or making work easier. They had no reason to believe that something so minor could carry such weight. But the reality was clear in the toll of illness. Every wave of fever and diarrhea, every unexplained death of a child, bore the hidden mark of fingers moistened with saliva. The gesture became known, in retrospect, as a kind of signature of infection. Each lick sealed the transfer of germs from the world into the body. The habit was so common that it shaped the health of entire communities, becoming one of the countless ways disease passed through Victorian life without anyone realizing. The act of licking fingers to turn pages or handle food carries germs directly into the mouth, fueling outbreaks of stomach illness and infection. It was accepted as natural, even clever, but it left behind a trail of suffering in homes across the city. From hands and saliva, infection also spread through gestures of affection, where the touch of lips that signalled love became instead another path for disease. The gesture of greeting among Victorian women often involved a kiss on the cheek. It was considered polite, affectionate, and proper. Mothers greeted daughters this way. Friends exchanged such kisses at church or in parlors, and relatives met with the same sign of closeness. The act seemed harmless, even noble, an expression of care wrapped in formality. Yet hidden within these gestures was one of the most dangerous diseases of the age, tuberculosis, or consumption as it was often called, spread silently through droplets carried in breath and saliva. When lips touched cheeks, when faces leaned close, the bacteria passed easily from one person to another. Tuberculosis haunted every street and home of Victorian cities. It was slow to reveal itself, often beginning as a light cough or persistent tiredness. A woman might greet her friends in the morning with kisses, smiling and speaking as though nothing were wrong, yet already be carrying the disease deep within her lungs. The bacteria moved outward in every breath, and the act of kissing made the exchange of infection certain. Families and communities often traced outbreaks not to strangers or distant contact, but to the very gestures of intimacy they valued most. The paradox was cruel. Society placed great weight on propriety and connection. To refuse a kiss on the cheek was seen as rude, even insulting. Women, especially, were expected to show warmth in this way. Refusal could mark one as cold or unfriendly. Yet each time cheeks pressed together, the bacteria had a chance to travel, in crowded parlors, at weddings, or during church gatherings. The ritual was repeated endlessly, turning homes into invisible sites of infection. It is grimly ironic that the very sign of affection became one of the greatest carriers of death. The medical understanding of tuberculosis was still developing. Some believed it was hereditary, passed down through blood. Others suspected it lingered in damp houses or bad air. Few recognized how directly it could be transmitted from one person to another. The gesture of kissing cheeks was never questioned as a possible danger. Families blamed fate or weakness when illness spread, never considering that a single greeting could have carried the infection that took a life. Symptoms advanced slowly, which masked the true danger: a cough that lingered, a gradual loss of weight, night sweats that soaked sheets. These signs crept forward without immediate alarm. By the time a woman showed clear symptoms, she might already have kissed dozens of friends and relatives. Each of those contacts became another link in a chain of transmission that stretched across households and neighborhoods. If we compare this to modern life, it would be like casually sharing water bottles with dozens of people during an influenza outbreak, believing it harmless. The shock of such a thought today highlights the danger that went unnoticed in Victorian times. I find it unsettling to imagine parlours filled with women leaning close, exchanging kisses, while unknowingly passing along one of the deadliest diseases of their age. The very rooms designed for hospitality and warmth became chambers of infection, yet the rituals continued without hesitation. The statistics of the time confirm the spread. Tuberculosis was one of the leading causes of death, claiming young and old alike. It moved easily among women who maintained close circles of contact. Children were infected early, their small bodies unable to resist. Husbands who kissed their wives each day carried it back to workplaces, where it spread further. The boundaries between home, social life, and labour collapsed under the invisible weight of disease. Doctors eventually noticed patterns. Clusters of cases often arose among families and groups of friends who spent time together regularly. Yet without understanding germs, they attributed this to shared environments rather than shared gestures. Ventilation was recommended, but no one thought to question the custom of kissing. Even when suspicions grew, the weight of tradition kept the practice alive. The kiss was too embedded in the culture of politeness to abandon. The consequences were heartbreaking. Women who appeared radiant and healthy one season wasted away by the next. Families buried daughters and sisters without realizing the greetings exchanged at their bedsides had sealed their fate. Communities grieved without grasping the true nature of what had spread among them. The kiss on the cheek remained a symbol of affection, even as it became the silent carrier of despair. Hospitals filled with consumptive patients, their hollow faces and constant coughing becoming familiar sights. Yet even within hospital walls, visitors continued to greet patients with kisses, unaware that they were not only comforting the sick but also ensuring their own exposure. The ritual was stronger than fear, binding society to patterns that guaranteed the persistence of the disease. This detail of life demonstrates the contradictions of Victorian values. A society that prided itself on morality and duty clung to gestures that endangered everyone. Politeness became more important than safety, appearance more important than truth. The cost was measured in thousands of lives lost to a disease spread partly by the very customs meant to show love. The kiss on the cheek was not harmless affection, but a pathway for tuberculosis, carrying death from lips to skin in households across Victorian society. It turned intimacy into infection and love into loss. While greetings carried germs between cheeks, another form of contact magnified the spread further, as repeated kisses built chains of transmission that linked entire communities in suffering. In 1881, a London physician recorded an observation that revealed the silent spread of tuberculosis in Victorian society. He wrote that nearly every patient he treated could be linked to another through the simple act of a kiss. What seemed like affection had become a channel of infection. The custom of pressing lips to a cheek or greeting with close contact was so common that no one questioned it. Yet for every exchange of warmth, the bacteria that caused tuberculosis gained another host. Families and communities were bound together not only by ties of love, but also by invisible threads of disease. The ritual of kissing as a greeting was not reserved for intimate partners. It passed between sisters, between mothers and daughters, and between friends meeting after church. In parlors and drawing rooms, women leaned in politely, making physical contact as a sign of trust and civility. To refuse such a greeting risked offence. Even the sick were not excluded. In fact, they were often kissed more often, as family and friends tried to comfort them. This multiplied the danger. It is darkly ironic that kindness itself became the carrier of one of the deadliest illnesses of the century. The diaries and reports from that time reveal how the disease travelled silently. A woman coughing lightly in the winter might be kissed by her children each morning and by her sisters when they visited. Months later, those same children would begin to cough, and the sisters would grow pale and thin. The pattern repeated across households, weaving an invisible map of infection through neighbourhoods. Doctors suspected the air in crowded rooms or the dampness of homes, but they underestimated the direct role of physical gestures. The slowness of tuberculosis made it even harder to trace. Unlike cholera or typhoid, which struck quickly, consumption moved gradually. A kiss given in the spring might not lead to visible symptoms until autumn. Families did not connect the two. When multiple members of a household fell ill, it was assumed to be fate or a shared environment. The idea that the gentle touch of lips to skin had introduced the bacteria was unthinkable. If we compare this to modern life, it would be like entire families becoming infected with a deadly virus simply by greeting one another with handshakes, while no one believed such a thing possible. I find it haunting to imagine the doctor writing in his journal, realizing that every patient had once kissed another who was already sick, and knowing that society would ignore his observation. His words captured the truth, but without a wider understanding of germs, little could be done. The culture of politeness was stronger than medical warnings. Inside homes, the chain of infection was relentless. Parents kissed children goodnight, siblings kissed each other in greeting, and visitors kissed their hosts upon arrival. Each gesture felt natural, even necessary. Yet each added another link in the chain. By the time a family realized that illness had settled among them, the disease had already spread beyond their walls. Communities mourned without grasping that their own customs had tied them together in sickness as much as in affection. The wards of hospitals are filled with consumptive patients. Their coughs echoed in long corridors, their bodies wasted to shadows of what they had been. Yet even within those walls, kisses persisted. Visitors kissed their loved ones at bedsides, bringing bacteria home with them. Children kissed parents too weak to rise. Nurses and attendants sometimes leaned close in comfort, unaware that they were sealing their own fates. The ritual endured even where its consequences were most visible. The persistence of the custom shows how cultural expectations can overpower reason. Even as suspicion grew that close contact carried risk, few dared to break tradition. A woman who refused to kiss her friend or relative might be judged cold, unfeeling, or arrogant. Better to risk sickness than to risk insult. In this way, tuberculosis spread not only through biology, but through the weight of social pressure. Medical journals of the time noted the growing scale of the problem. Tuberculosis claimed thousands of lives each year, yet no effective cure was known. Ventilation and rest were recommended, but they were poor defences against a disease spread through intimate gestures. Physicians tried to encourage caution, but their words were too weak against centuries of custom. The kiss remained untouchable, too deeply embedded in the fabric of social life to be abandoned. For women, the cost was especially heavy. Their social circles demanded constant interaction, from tea gatherings to church meetings. They exchanged kisses daily, linking one household to another. Infections passed along these lines faster than anyone realized. Children, already vulnerable, suffered most. They grew sick young, and many never recovered. Entire families lost generations, with kisses serving as both the symbol of affection and the mechanism of tragedy. This detail of life underscores the contradictions of Victorian society. A culture obsessed with morality and propriety unknowingly built its customs around a deadly practice. Politeness masked danger, and intimacy became infection. What should have been a moment of care was in fact a moment of exposure. The doctor's note from 1881 captured this irony perfectly. Every patient carried with them the memory of a kiss, and every kiss carried with it the seeds of disease. The kisses exchanged in Victorian parlours were not harmless greetings, but open invitations to tuberculosis. They spread the disease silently, binding communities together in loss as much as in love. As lips pressed against cheeks, germs moved from body to body, unnoticed and unstoppable. While these gestures carried sickness in social spaces, another equally ordinary item, a simple piece of cloth passed hand to hand, would prove just as effective in carrying infection through both homes and workplaces. Handkerchiefs were prized possessions in Victorian households. Women carried them as signs of modesty and refinement, folding them neatly into sleeves or tucking them into pockets. They were meant to be personal items, yet in practice, they were often shared among family and friends. A woman might wipe her brow in the heat of a crowded market, then pass the same cloth to her daughter. A friend might borrow it to dab her lips after tea. The gesture seemed harmless, even generous, but each exchange turned the cloth into a carrier of disease. Damp fabric held bacteria and provided the perfect environment for it to multiply. By the time the handkerchief returned to its original owner, it was no longer personal but communal, bearing the invisible touch of everyone who had used it. The habit of sharing extended into the home. Mothers wiped children's faces with the same cloth they had used for themselves earlier in the day. Husbands used it to blow their noses before it was tucked back into a wife's apron. When evening came, the cloth was placed with laundry, often alongside undergarments and soiled diapers. Everything was washed together in cold well water, rarely with soap. The wash did little to eliminate bacteria. Instead, it redistributed contamination across fabrics that would be worn again the next morning. The dampness of the cloth made the risk especially severe. Unlike hard surfaces, fabric absorbed moisture and held it. Handkerchiefs tucked away in pockets or drawers remained wet for hours. In that time, bacteria continued to grow, multiplying unseen. The cloth looked harmless once it dried, but the contamination lingered. Women pressed these same cloths to their faces, carrying infection directly to their eyes, mouths, and noses. Families learned to associate constant colds, sore throats, and skin infections with bad air or weak constitutions, never with the handkerchiefs they shared so casually. It almost seems absurd that what was considered a mark of refinement could also serve as a rag passed from one germ-covered face to another. Yet in Victorian society, where access to fresh linen was limited, such sharing was natural. The expectation of thrift meant nothing was wasted, and handkerchiefs were washed and reused until they fell apart. In the meantime, they carried illness between households without anyone realizing. Workplaces continued the pattern. Women in factories or workshops brought cloths to wipe away sweat and soot. During breaks, they often passed them to co-workers, laughing as they shared relief. But the relief was temporary, and the risks long-lasting. Skin diseases and respiratory infections spread easily in such environments, where poor ventilation already makes breathing difficult. Each borrowed cloth added another layer of exposure. If we compare this to modern life, it would be like sharing the same damp face mask with half a dozen co-workers during flu season. The thought feels reckless now, but in the absence of knowledge about germs, Victorians saw nothing wrong with it. Their sense of community even encouraged the habit, as sharing was considered polite and generous. I find it disturbing to picture mothers folding away damp cloths that had been used by several people, believing that a rinse in cold water would make them safe again. They had no way of knowing they were storing illness alongside their linens. The clothes seemed clean, smelled faintly of starch or soap on good days, and were tucked back into sleeves as though nothing had happened. Doctors who treated recurring infections often overlooked the role of handkerchiefs. They focused instead on diet, climate, or general constitution. When women arrived with persistent skin sores or throat inflammation, they were told to rest or take tonics. The true cause remained invisible. Even when reformers spoke of hygiene, they rarely mentioned everyday items like clothes. Advice focused on water supplies or sanitation of streets, not on the shared fabric passing from hand to hand. The cycle of infection was not confined to homes or factories. Public gatherings made the habit even more dangerous. At churches, concerts, or theatres, women sometimes lent handkerchiefs to friends overcome by heat or emotion. Tears, sweat, and mucus were dabbed away with cloths that returned to their owners damp and contaminated. No one questioned the practice. On the contrary, it was praised as thoughtful and ladylike. The act of sharing strengthened social bonds while quietly spreading illness. Laundry itself reinforced the problem. Handkerchiefs were rarely boiled. They were washed in cold water, wrung out, and hung in damp attics where mould grew freely. Once dry, they looked fresh enough, though faint stains remained. The hidden bacteria survived, waiting for the next use. Each cycle of wash and reuse spreads the problem further, embedding infection into the very fabric of daily life. The poorest families suffered most. With only a handful of clothes to rotate, sharing was unavoidable. A single handkerchief might serve an entire family over the course of a day. Mothers used it to clean children's faces, then handed it to husbands as they left for work. By nightfall, the fabric was saturated with sweat, spit, and dirt. Yet it was carefully folded and placed aside until wash day. Thrift demanded nothing be discarded, even when it carried sickness. Hospitals occasionally documented outbreaks linked to such habits. Nurses noted that women admitted with eye infections or respiratory illnesses often came from households where cloths were shared. But the connection remained anecdotal, never addressed in public campaigns. The lack of regulation meant the cycle continued, woven invisibly into everyday life. The story of handkerchiefs and shared cloths shows how ordinary habits can create extraordinary risks. What appeared to be kindness and thrift was in reality a practice of contamination. Each time a cloth passed from one hand to another, it became a vessel of disease. Yet society praised the gesture, never suspecting that politeness and generosity could carry such hidden costs. The shared handkerchiefs of Victorian life carried bacteria between family members, friends, and co-workers, spreading infections through the most ordinary acts. They seemed harmless, but functioned as silent tools of transmission. While cloths spread illness in homes and workplaces, other remedies made matters worse, as women turned to self-made concoctions that promised cleanliness but instead deepened the harm. Victorian homes did not stock bottles of mouthwash lined neatly on shelves. Instead, women turned to whatever materials they could find, guided by folk recipes passed down through families or whispered in marketplaces. Rinsing the mouth was seen as a way to appear clean and refined, but the methods were anything but safe. Old wine or stale beer was often used as the base. Leftovers from the bottom of bottles, long turned sour, were swished around the teeth and gums. To this base, people added powders scraped from fireplaces or even the liquid gathered from chamber pots left to ferment. The result was a harsh, foul-tasting mixture poured into the mouth in the belief that it killed germs. In truth, it often created the perfect breeding ground for new infections. The logic behind these concoctions came from tradition rather than science. Ash from fireplaces was thought to be cleansing, a remnant of burned wood that seemed pure. Urine, especially when left to stand until it produced ammonia, was believed to whiten teeth and strengthen gums. Alcohol from spoiled drinks was considered a disinfectant, strong enough to wash away dirt. Mixed together, they produced a burning sensation on the tongue and throat. Women mistook this burning for effectiveness. They assumed the pain meant the liquid was working. It is almost grimly comical that a recipe including stale beer, ash, and urine was considered the height of dental care. The damage these mixtures caused was severe. The mouth is lined with delicate tissue, easily damaged by caustic substances. Ash scraped away enamel and irritated gums. Ammonia from urine burned the soft lining of the cheeks and throat. Alcohol dried the tissue, leaving it more vulnerable to cracks and sores. Women often developed ulcers that refused to heal, bleeding gums, and chronic throat pain. Some infections spread deeper, leading to swelling in the jaw or fever that makes swallowing difficult. Yet these symptoms were explained away as bad humours or weakness, never connected to the rinses themselves. The social expectation of cleanliness drove the practice. A clean mouth was a sign of refinement, something women were expected to maintain as carefully as their hair or dresses. Without access to safe products, they improvised with what they had. Recipes varied from household to household, but all shared the same flaws. They destroyed the natural balance of the mouth. Neighbours compared notes, passing along advice with pride, never realising they were sharing methods of harm. If we compared this to modern times, it would be like mixing bleach, spoiled wine, and household cleaner into a bottle and marketing it as a refreshing mint rinse. The absurdity is clear now, but in Victorian kitchens it was ordinary. I find it unsettling to imagine women standing at their washstands, tilting their heads back and gargling mixtures that burn their throats while believing they were protecting themselves. The image reflects not carelessness but desperation, shaped by poverty and ignorance. They lacked better choices, and the market offered little beyond false promises. Doctors occasionally encountered the consequences. Patients arrived with raw mouths, swollen glands, and difficulty speaking or eating. Some developed deep infections that spread beyond the oral cavity. A few died when untreated abscesses blocked their throats or poisoned their blood. Physicians sometimes warned against harsh rinses, but they rarely named the recipes directly, unwilling to criticize practices so widespread. Their silence left the cycle unbroken. The problem was not confined to homes. Markets sold ready-made powders and liquids that claimed to freshen the mouth. Many were little more than ash mixed with cheap alcohol. Some were labelled as restoratives or cleansing waters and carried higher prices, but their ingredients were nearly identical to homemade versions. Sellers took advantage of ignorance, knowing that customers equated burning sensations with effectiveness. The trade flourished, while infections multiplied. The practice reveals the contradictions of Victorian life. A society that prided itself on progress in science and medicine still relied on medieval remedies for something as simple as oral hygiene. Women bore the brunt of this contradiction. They were judged by their appearance and cleanliness, forced to maintain standards with tools that harmed them. Their smiles, praised in parlors and gatherings, often hid mouths lined with sores. Inside households, the habit became routine. After meals, women swished their mixtures, grimacing at the taste but reassured by the sting. Children sometimes imitate their mothers, rinsing with watered-down versions of the same liquids. This passed infection to younger generations, normalizing damage as part of life. The silence around these practices meant no one questioned them openly. They were as much a part of daily routine as brushing hair or tying laces. The makeshift rinses of Victorian women turned mouths into breeding grounds for ulcers, infections, and lasting damage. What was meant to create cleanliness instead seeded disease. While women gargled in private, thinking they were defending themselves from illness, they were in fact weakening their bodies. From mouths and throats, the story of infection moved outward, surfacing at gatherings where shared cups and spoons carried these same germs from one person to many. Afternoon tea was one of the most cherished rituals of Victorian society. Women gathered in parlours, sitting beneath chandeliers or near lace-draped windows, to share small cakes, sandwiches, and lively conversation. It was meant to be a moment of refinement, a pause in the day when politeness and elegance took centre stage. Yet in 1886, a record from the Medical Library in London described how one such gathering became the source of illness. Within days, 5 women who had attended the same tea party fell ill with inflamed gums, painful swelling, and difficulty eating. The outbreak traced back not to spoiled food or bad water, but to the shared utensils of the event. A single spoon used to serve cakes and a single glass of lemonade passed among all the guests, carrying staphylococcus from one woman's mouth to the rest. The scene at the gathering would not have looked unusual. A tray of sweets sat in the centre, each piece small enough to be lifted with the same serving spoon. The hostess, wishing to maintain grace, offered a large glass of lemonade to her guests, who each took sips in turn. To refuse would have been impolite, and politeness mattered more than caution. No one considered the possibility that saliva left on the rim of the glass or on the spoon might carry danger. What was exchanged appeared to be kindness, but in reality, it was infection. It almost seems absurd that delicacy and refinement were performed with a single spoon dipped into many mouths. The woman who first spread the bacteria had no idea she was a carrier. She had recently rinsed her mouth with a homemade solution of alcohol, ash, and herbs, believing it would cleanse and refresh her. Instead, it irritated her gums, leaving them raw and vulnerable to infection. Staphylococcus bacteria flourished in the damaged tissue. When she ate from the shared spoon and drank from the common glass, the bacteria transferred easily. Within days, her companions showed the same symptoms. The illness progressed quickly. The women developed painful redness along their gums. Small ulcers appeared, and the swelling made chewing difficult. Some experienced fevers and swollen lymph nodes as the infection spread deeper. Their elegant gathering, meant to display refinement, ended with each of them suffering in private rooms, unable to eat comfortably and frightened by the sudden decline in health. Families consulted doctors, who recorded the unusual outbreak in medical notes. The doctors traced the connection only after questioning each household. They discovered that all 5 women had attended the same tea. The details of shared utensils emerged, pointing clearly to the source. But even with this knowledge, little could be done to prevent repetition. Social customs made it nearly impossible to eliminate shared serving spoons or common glasses. Etiquette dictated closeness and sharing, while science had not yet penetrated daily life. If we compare this to modern times, it would be like dozens of people at a dinner party using the same straw to drink from one glass. The thought is disturbing now, yet in Victorian society, it was considered friendly and polite. I find it unsettling to imagine a parlour filled with laughter and conversation, where the guests leaned forward eagerly for a sip of lemonade, completely unaware that each touch of the glass rim carried the same invisible threat. The very symbol of hospitality became a vessel of infection, turning what should have been a pleasant memory into a shared misfortune. The outbreak reflected broader patterns of the age. Shared utensils were common not only in homes but also in workplaces, schools, and hospitals. In kitchens, multiple hands dipped into the same bowl of porridge or stew. At factories, workers often shared cups when drinking water. In hospitals, spoons used to administer medicines were sometimes rinsed quickly and reused. The culture of thrift and efficiency encouraged these habits, but they created constant opportunities for bacteria to spread. For the women of the Tea Party, the stigma was also painful. Illness affecting the mouth was often whispered about as a sign of poor hygiene or even immoral behaviour. To admit to infection felt shameful. Some concealed their condition, seeking home remedies instead of doctors. This silence allowed bacteria to thrive and spread further in families, even when the source was known. The embarrassment of acknowledging it meant the practice of sharing utensils did not end. The case was recorded in medical literature as an example of how ordinary customs could carry extraordinary risks. Reformers began to argue for changes in etiquette, suggesting that serving spoons should be kept separate and individual glasses provided. But resistance was strong, old habits were difficult to break, and many dismissed warnings as unnecessary or exaggerated. The cycle of politeness continued, ensuring that outbreaks would happen again. This story reveals once more the contradictions of Victorian life. A society that celebrated progress in science and industry ignored the dangers hidden in its own homes. Etiquette and appearances were valued above health. Women bore the consequences, suffering in silence from infections that began not with reckless acts but with gestures of hospitality. The tea table, symbol of refinement, became a stage for the spread of disease. The outbreak at the 1886 Tea Party showed how easily bacteria could travel through shared utensils. 5 women suffered from the same painful infection, all traced back to a single spoon and glass. What seemed like generosity and grace was in truth a mechanism of harm. While germs moved silently between guests in parlours, another source of damage was simmering in kitchens, where homemade soap intended to clean instead created new irritations and infections. Soap was not always purchased in neat bars wrapped in paper, stacked in shops with printed labels. For many Victorian women, especially those with little money, soap was something they made at home. The process seemed simple and resourceful. Collect kitchen grease, usually the fat skimmed from old cooking pots, and mix it with the ashes scraped from fireplaces. This blend, boiled until it thickened, hardened into what was called soap. It carried the smell of whatever meals had been cooked before, tinged with the sharp odour of burned wood. To those who made it, this seemed natural and thrifty, a way to save coins while keeping the household supplied. But what looked like an act of practicality was in truth another trap for health. The fat used in these mixtures was rarely fresh. Leftovers from pans, often rancid, were saved in jars until enough was collected to make a batch. By the time it was boiled, the fat had already broken down, carrying bacteria and an unpleasant stench that boiling could not fully remove. Ash, scraped from hearths, often contained fragments of burned food, coal, or even rubbish. Combined together, these ingredients did not create the cleansing product imagined. Instead, they formed a substance that irritated skin, left residues, and failed to clean properly. Women who washed with it often emerged with skin that stung or itched, their bodies coated with an invisible layer of grease and grit. It is almost laughable that something made from rancid fat and fireplace debris was proudly called soap. The irritation was worst in areas where the skin was most sensitive, under arms, where sweat collected. The roughness of the mixture caused constant chafing. Around the genitals, the effect was harsher still. Women complained of redness, swelling, and sores that never fully healed. Instead of soothing, the soap aggravated. During hot summers, the combination of heat, sweat, and poorly made soap led to outbreaks of painful rashes. Families accepted these problems as part of life, never linking them to the very product they believed was keeping them clean. Cleanliness in the Victorian age was both a necessity and a social expectation. A woman was judged by her appearance, by the freshness of her clothes, and the neatness of her body. Without affordable commercial soap, many relied on their homemade versions to meet these standards. The irony was cruel. In trying to preserve dignity, they were damaging their own skin. Women carried the marks of their efforts, sores beneath clothing, discomfort that lingered day and night. Yet they pressed on, believing irritation was preferable to dirt. The problem was compounded by the lack of real understanding of bacteria. Germ theory was still new, and in many homes, it was barely acknowledged. To most families, dirt was visible, something that could be scrubbed away. If the skin looked free of soot and dust, they believed it was clean. Invisible threats were beyond imagination. So a bar of homemade soap, no matter how foul-smelling or gritty, seemed sufficient as long as it removed surface stains. If we compare this to today, it would be like using dishwater mixed with engine oil as a substitute for a bottle of antibacterial soap from the store. What seems unthinkable now was ordinary in countless kitchens and washstands. I find it deeply unsettling to imagine women washing themselves carefully, believing they were protecting their health, while every stroke of the cloth only spread irritation and left bacteria to thrive. The effort and hope behind these routines make the harm even more tragic. They were not careless. They were doing what they thought was right, guided by poverty and tradition. Doctors did occasionally warn of the risks. Some reported cases of persistent skin infections, especially during warmer months, where the link to poor soap seemed obvious. Yet these warnings rarely changed habits. To stop making soap at home meant buying it in shops, and the price was beyond reach for many. Even when women could afford a small bar of commercial soap, it was often diluted or adulterated by sellers trying to increase profit. The poor were trapped between bad options, forced to choose between irritation at home or fraud in the marketplace. The consequences spread beyond individuals. Children washed in the same tubs with the same harsh soap, their skin developing rashes that parents assumed were seasonal or caused by diet. Men, after long days in factories, returned home to the same soap, carrying the irritation back to work. Illnesses linked to poor hygiene became common, yet the deeper cause was never addressed. Reformers called for better access to affordable, safe soap, but their voices were drowned out by larger debates about industry and economics. The persistence of homemade soap reflected the contradictions of Victorian life. An era that celebrated progress in science and industry allowed families to wash with products that harmed them daily. Beneath the image of refinement and advancement lay households rubbing their skin raw with mixtures of rot and ash. Poverty dictated habits, and those habits left marks on bodies for years. In homes, the soap sat beside basins, its surface streaked with grey from ash and darkened by rancid fat. Women scrubbed collars and cuffs with it, then used the same piece on their bodies. The smell lingered in fabrics and clung to the air of small rooms. Guests might notice, but rarely commented, as the odour was common enough to escape remark. The illusion of cleanliness was preserved, while the truth of irritation and infection remained hidden under clothing. The story of homemade soap reveals not only the dangers of poverty, but also the power of appearances. Cleanliness was a social demand, but the means to achieve it were out of reach for many. Improvised solutions seemed clever in the moment, but they carried consequences that worsened health instead of protecting it. Families believed they were saving money and maintaining dignity, yet what they saved in coins, they lost in comfort and safety. Homemade soap, built from rancid fat and fireplace ash, turned washing into a slow form of harm. It stripped away neither germs nor risk, but it reinforced the illusion of respectability. Women bore the cost in sores, irritation, and infections that returned with every bath. What looked like thrift was in fact another symptom of desperation, hidden beneath the polished image of Victorian order. The use of self-made soap showed how resourcefulness could slide into danger. Women did not see the line between cleanliness and contamination because the tools of knowledge were not in their hands. As long as the bar looked solid, as long as water and rubbing made suds, they believed they had done their duty. Behind that duty lay a quiet cycle of suffering that no polite parlour conversation ever mentioned. The women rubbed their skin, the smell of rancid fat filling the air, while believing they were moving closer to refinement. In reality, they were carrying infections into their homes, spreading irritation among their families, and fueling outbreaks that no one wished to discuss. Their pursuit of dignity came at a price written on their very skin. The practice of making soap at home out of necessity left countless women with burning rashes, festering sores, and no true protection against disease. The truth was not hidden, but ignored, smothered under the belief that what was common must be safe. As these women washed in their basins, they believed they were defending themselves from filth. In truth, they were inviting it in. The irritation and infections left by homemade soap were only part of the story. In the kitchens and parlours where this soap was used, another danger was spreading through the very air they breathed. The final image in this long journey through Victorian hygiene is that of a noblewoman, whose death seemed mysterious at first glance. She lived in comfort, surrounded by servants, wrapped in expensive fabrics, and praised for her elegance. Yet when illness came, it came not from the outside world of filth and crowded markets, but from the very clothing she wore closest to her skin. Her story was recorded quietly, almost as an aside, because no one wished to admit that such wealth and status could not protect a woman from decay hidden within her own garments. She suffered fever, chills, and eventually sepsis. Her body weakened as doctors tried treatments common for the time: bleeding, tonics, and rest. But nothing worked. When she finally passed away, her household was left stunned, unable to explain how a woman so carefully guarded could fall so suddenly. Only later, when servants prepared her belongings for disposal, did the truth come to light. The innermost layer of her gown, worn directly against her skin, was covered in mould. The fabric crumbled, blackened, and smelled faintly of mildew. What had appeared fine on the outside had been poisoning her from within. It is almost laughable that a gown meant to display wealth and refinement became the very cause of her death. The practices of the time explain how such a thing could happen. Wealthy women owned multiple layers of dresses, often 5 or more, worn at once. The outer fabrics were brushed, perfumed, and occasionally aired out. The inner layers, however, especially petticoats and underdresses, were rarely washed. Cleaning them was considered unnecessary and damaging to fine fabric. Instead, they were left to dry in breezy halls, sprinkled with flowers to hide odours. This created a perfect environment for bacteria and mould to grow. As days turned into weeks, the moisture from sweat and body oil soaked the cloth. Victorian gowns were heavy, trapping heat and dampness close to the skin. Without washing, the accumulation became a silent danger. The noblewoman's body absorbed this constant exposure until infection spread. Doctors at the time did not connect clothing with disease. They blamed weakness, humours, or simply fate. The truth remained unspoken. Inside her home, appearances mattered above all. Guests praised her elegance, noting the crispness of her gowns and the perfection of her posture. They never saw the crumbling fabric hidden beneath. Even her family remained unaware. To them, her sickness was an unfortunate accident, a twist of nature. But to her servants, who touched the decayed fabric with their own hands, the cause was undeniable. The noblewoman had died because she had not washed her dress for 5 months. The tragedy was not unique. Other deaths like hers were whispered among staff in large households. But these whispers never reached the wider world. Families hid the truth to preserve their reputation. doctors recorded symptoms without naming causes. As a result, many women continued to wear unwashed clothing for months at a time, believing perfume and flowers would keep them safe. If we compare this to today, it would be like someone wearing the same sweaty gym clothes for months, spraying them with perfume and wondering why they ended up with blood poisoning. The absurdity is striking, yet it was reality in Victorian society. I cannot help but feel a deep unease when imagining the silence of that household, the quiet funeral, and the knowledge that her death was preventable. It was not poverty that doomed her, but ignorance mixed with vanity. The phrase used later by one doctor, "the death without smell," captures the chilling essence. Unlike cholera, which announced itself with foul odours, or typhoid, which spread with obvious violence, this death left almost no outward sign. It was quiet, almost polite, perfectly suited to the world of Victorian refinement. But beneath that politeness was rot. This story serves as the closing reminder that hygiene in the Victorian age was shaped less by knowledge and more by appearances. People believed what they saw: clean fabrics on the outside, perfumes masking reality, polite society ignoring the details. But the unseen truth killed as efficiently as any epidemic. Mold and bacteria were no respecters of class. They thrived as easily in silk and lace as in rags and wool. Her death also demonstrates the dangerous gap between progress and daily life. This was an era of railways, factories, and inventions. Yet within the walls of a wealthy home, a woman could still die because her clothing was not washed. Civilization advanced quickly in some areas, but in others, it remained medieval. It is this contradiction that makes Victorian history both fascinating and unsettling. We can see now how each small habit, sharing combs, reusing cloths, bathing in dirty water, or leaving gowns unwashed, contributed to cycles of infection. No one act seemed shocking at the time, but together they shaped a world where disease thrived quietly. The noblewoman's mouldy gown is simply the last example, one that symbolises how far appearances could drift from reality. Her story closes this exploration into the hidden dangers of Victorian hygiene. From poisoned candy and toxic cosmetics to rancid soap and rotting fabric, every detail shows how fragile life was, even for those who seemed untouchable. The empire built on progress carried decay in its very foundations, hidden behind lace, perfume, and silence. The noble woman was buried, her gowns destroyed, and her household continued as before. But her death, though quiet, still speaks across time. It warns us that no society, however proud, can afford to ignore the simplest truths of health. Appearances fade. What matters is what lies beneath. Her life ended in silence, but her story remains a haunting close to this long journey through the unseen dangers of the Victorian age. She died because of mould hidden in her gowns. This death, though whispered and forgotten by her world, is remembered now as a symbol of the hazards that Victorian women faced every day. It reminds us that history is not only grand events and noble deeds, but also quiet tragedies that shape the lives of ordinary people. It is in these silences that we find the true cost of ignorance. The journey through these 23 parts has shown the many ways Victorian hygiene turned daily life into a silent battlefield. From the market stalls to the bedrooms of nobles, danger hid in plain sight. Each detail was a thread in the larger tapestry of suffering, woven into the fabric of an empire that prized appearance over truth. The tale of the noblewoman's final illness closes this history, but the echoes remain. They remind us of what happens when society hides behind perfumes and lace instead of confronting the realities of health. Good night, and may your rest be safe, clean, and free of the silent dangers that haunted the Victorians.